In the year 1247, in the rolling hills of Normandy, a young apprentice named Edmund finds himself beginning his first autumn among the cathedral builders. The work is simple and unhurried, shaping stone, learning the patience required to build something that will last for centuries. This is a story of quiet hands, ancient craft, and the gentle unfolding of skill. Good evening and welcome. I am glad you are here. Our story tonight takes us to the cathedral workshop, where Edmund tends to his craft with an unhurried rhythm that invites the mind to slow, the body to rest. Let yourself be carried along by the story's gentle current. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Simply listen and let the story carry you towards sleep. Edmund, 17 years old, stood in the morning light of the workshop, his palms still tender and unmarked. The cool stone beneath his fingertips held the faint dampness of the autumn air that drifted through the open archway. Around him, older craftsmen moved with a quietness that seemed to make time itself slow. The scent of fresh stone dust hung in the space, not unpleasant, but clean like earth after rain. Master Guillaume, who had agreed to teach him the craft, set a block of pale limestone before him. The stone was roughly squared, waiting. Guillaume's own hands, weathered and capable, showed Edmund how to hold the chisel, not with tension, but with an ease that suggested the work was a conversation rather than a struggle. The morning light caught the stone's surface, revealing veins of pale gold running through the gray. "You must listen to the stone," Guillaume said, his voice unhurried and warm. He was a patient man. Edmund was learning, with gray-streaked hair and fingers that bore the marks of 40 years at this trade. "It will tell you where it wishes to break, where it resists. Your job is to listen, not to force." Edmund nodded, absorbing not just the words but the peaceful certainty with which they were offered. He took the chisel in his own hands, feeling its weight settle against his palm. The tool was old, its handle worn smooth by generations of hands. When he struck it gently with the hammer, a motion Guillaume had shown him 3 times now, with perfect patience, the stone responded with a soft crack. The fragment fell away, and Edmund felt a small warmth bloom in his chest. He had moved the stone. He had listened to it, as Guillaume said, and it had answered. The workshop around him continued its gentle rhythm. 2 other apprentices worked at different stones, their movements sure and practiced. An older craftsman shaped an elaborate capital, the ornamental top of a column, his chisel moving with a precision that seemed almost meditative. The sound was rhythmic, the soft tap of hammer on chisel, the whisper of stone dust settling, the ambient sounds of the cathedral beyond, bells ringing the hours, the distant sound of workers on scaffolding, the wind moving through the high stone arches. Guillaume moved to stand beside Edmund, observing but not interrupting. This was his way. Edmund was learning. The old craftsman offered instruction when needed, but mostly he allowed his apprentices to discover the work through their hands. There was no hurry in him, no frustration at the slow pace of learning. By midday, Edmund had worked 6 shallow channels into his stone, each one a small meditation. His shoulders had begun to ache pleasantly, the kind of tiredness that came from honest work rather than struggle. The stone had grown familiar under his hands. He was beginning to know its particular grain, the the places where it yielded easily and the places where it asked for patience. A bell rang for the midday rest. Edmund set down his tools with the care Guillaume had taught him, not dropped carelessly, but placed with respect on the wooden bench. The craftsman moved toward a small room adjoining the workshop where bread, cheese, and ale waited. The food was simple, hearty, and warm with the comfort of routine. Edmund, 17 years old with his tender, unmarked palms, sat beside Guillaume and ate his bread slowly. The older man's work-weathered hands held his food with the same gentleness he brought to his tools. Around them, conversation drifted in low voices, not gossip or urgency, but the easy talk of men who had worked together for years, content in each other's presence. "You have good instincts," Guillaume said, turning to Edmund with quiet approval. "Your last strike, you felt the resistance in the stone before it broke. Most apprentices force until the stone shatters. You listened." Edmund felt warmth spread through him with these words. Praise he was discovering meant more when it was rare and genuine. He bit into his cheese, tasting its sharpness, and looked out the small window toward the cathedral's stone walls, golden in the afternoon light. After the meal, the craftsmen returned to their work. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. Edmund returned to his stone with a sense of purpose that was entirely free from urgency. This stone would take days, weeks, perhaps a month to shape into the decorative molding Guillaume had described. There was no timeline, no pressure. The work would unfold as it needed to unfold. His chisel struck again and again and again. Each strike was a small meditation. His breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of his work. Inhale as he positioned the chisel, exhale as he struck. Around him, the other craftsmen worked in their own rhythms, each one a variation on the same peaceful theme. The sound created a kind of music, a gentle percussion that seemed to settle the mind rather than stimulate it. As the afternoon deepened, Edmund found that his awareness had narrowed to a peaceful point. The stone, the chisel, the hammer, the dust that rose like incense in the slanted light, the scent of the stone itself, that clean, ancient smell that suggested earth and time and patience. His hands grew warmer as he worked, the coldness of the morning replaced by the pleasant heat of exertion. Guillaume moved past him once, pausing to observe the work. He said nothing, but Edmund felt the approval in his silence. There was a kind of conversation happening without words, the language of two craftsmen understanding each other through the work itself. By the time the bells rang for vespers, the evening prayer service, Edmund's stone had begun to show its intended shape. The rough channels he'd carved were becoming something more defined. He could see now what Guillaume had meant when he described the finished piece. The vision was becoming visible in the stone itself. The craftsmen set down their tools and made their way toward the cathedral. Edmund followed Guillaume, feeling the pleasant tiredness in his arms and shoulders. The workshop grew quiet behind them, the tools resting, the stones waiting patiently for tomorrow's hands. In the cathedral, the light fell through the high stone windows in amber columns. The air was cool and held the faint scent of incense. Edmund knelt beside Guillaume as the evening prayers began, his mind still half in the workshop, feeling the phantom weight of the hammer in his palm. The monks' voices rose in the psalms, their Latin words echoing against the same stone that Edmund was learning to shape, the same stone that men like him had cut and fitted for centuries to create this space. The candles were being lit as darkness gathered outside. Edmund watched the flames bloom one after another, each one a small warmth against the growing evening. He thought of the stone, waiting in the workshop. Tomorrow he will return and continue the work. And the day after that, and many days after that, the pattern would repeat, a rhythm as old as the cathedral itself. When the prayers concluded, Edmund made his way back toward the craftsmen's quarters. The evening air was cool on his face, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the kitchen fires. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, a sound that spoke of the deepening night and the approaching time for rest. In the small room he shared with two other apprentices, Edmund lay on his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. His hands still held the memory of the stone. His shoulders ached pleasantly. His mind was quiet, filled with the contentment that came from a day of honest work, skillfully guided, with no pressure beyond the work itself. The darkness was complete and comforting. Tomorrow the workshop will be waiting. The stone would be waiting. Guillaume would be there, patient and wise, showing him gradually, day by day, how to become a craftsman. There was no hurry. There was only the work, unfolding slowly, like honey pouring from a jar, like time itself slowing to match the pace of stone. Edmund's breathing deepened. His mind released its hold on the day. And in the darkness of the craftsman's quarters, 17 years old with his tender palms growing gradually stronger, he drifted toward sleep, his hands still remembering the shape of the hammer, the feel of the chisel, the ancient patience of the stone. Edmund woke to the sound of the workshop bell, not the great cathedral bells that marked the hours of prayer, but the smaller, softer bell that called the craftsmen to begin their day. The darkness beyond his window was still nearly complete, but the quality of it had changed. Dawn was coming, though it would take its time arriving. He rose from his bed and dressed in the cool air, pulling on his wool tunic and linen shirt. His palms, when he looked at them, showed the first small marks from yesterday's work, not calluses yet, but the beginning of them. He traced one mark with his other thumb, feeling the slight tenderness. The stone had begun to mark him, as it marked all who worked with it. The workshop was already warm when he arrived. Guillaume had lit the fires in the small braziers that kept the space comfortable during the cooler months. The older craftsman stood at the stone table, studying a rolled parchment that showed the design for a new arch. His graying brown hair caught the firelight as he bent over the drawing. He was a patient man. Edmund was learning with each passing day, and also a meticulous one. Every decision about how the stones would be shaped, where they would fit, how they would support the weight of the cathedral above them, all of this came from years of knowing not just the craft, but the structure itself. "Good morning, Edmund," Guillaume said without looking up from the parchment. "The light will be good today. We can begin the next phase of your stone." Edmund made his way to his work table, where the limestone block waited exactly as he had left it. The dust from yesterday had settled, and the stone seemed to glow faintly in the early morning light. He set out his tools with the care Guillaume had taught him. the chisels in order from largest to smallest, the hammers within easy reach, the cloth for wiping the dust. Another apprentice, a boy named Thomas who was perhaps a year ahead of Edmund in his training, arrived shortly after. Thomas, 18 years old, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had begun to master the basics of the craft. His hands were already developing the particular calluses that came from years of this work, and his movements held none of Edmund's deliberation. He simply knew, without thinking, where to place each tool, how much force to apply, when to pause and listen to the stone. Thomas nodded to Edmund in greeting, a simple acknowledgement between two young men beginning the same journey on different timelines. He moved to his own work, a more complex piece that Guillaume had assigned him. The stone he was shaping would eventually become part of a window frame, and it required more precision than Edmund's decorative molding. By the time the morning was truly underway, the workshop had settled into its rhythm. The sound of chisels and hammers created a gentle percussion that seemed to slow the mind rather than quicken it. The dust rose in the light, catching it like golden particles suspended in water. The scent of the stone, that clean, earthy smell, filled the space, mixing faintly with the smoke from the braziers. Guillaume moved between the apprentices, offering guidance when needed. With Edmund, he stopped to show him a new technique, how to angle the chisel to create a sharper edge on the decorative carving. The demonstration took only a moment. Guillaume showed him once, twice, then stepped back to let Edmund's hands discover the motion themselves. There was no pressure in this teaching, no expectation that Edmund would master it immediately. There was only the patient repetition, the gentle correction when needed, and the steady confidence that understanding would come in its own time. "The stone teaches you if you listen," Guillaume said as Edmund worked through the new motion. "Your hands will remember this, even when your mind forgets the instruction. Trust your hands." Edmund found this to be true. As he repeated the angled cut, his hands began to understand what his mind was still learning. The motion became smoother, more natural. The stone responded differently to this angle. It yielded more easily, creating the sharp definition Guillaume was guiding him toward. By midday, Edmund had completed nearly a third of the decorative molding. The progression was visible now. What had been a rough block was becoming something with intention, with purpose. He could see the final form emerging from the stone, the way a sculptor sees the figure already present in the marble, waiting to be revealed. At midday rest, Edmund and Thomas sat together on a bench in the small eating room. The bread was warm today, freshly baked in the cathedral's ovens. The cheese was sharp and satisfying. There were dried apples, too, which meant the kitchens had good stores from the autumn harvest. "How are your hands holding up?" Thomas asked. He had a friendly way about him, Edmund was learning, though he was careful not to offer false encouragement. "They'll hurt more before they hurt less, but Guillaume says the pain means they're becoming stronger." "Mine are already starting to hurt," Edmund admitted. "But it's not a bad pain, it feels like work." Thomas nodded, understanding completely. "That's how you know you're doing it right. If it didn't challenge your hands, you wouldn't be learning." He bit into his bread, then added, "Guillaume will start teaching you the more complex shapes soon. Once you've got the basic cuts down, the arches are where the real skill comes in. Edmund felt a small flutter of something, not quite anxiety, but anticipation tinged with uncertainty. The thought of creating the curved, complex shapes that formed the cathedral's arches seemed impossibly far away. Yet at the same time, he could feel himself moving toward it, step by step, day by day. After the meal, the craftsmen returned to their work. The afternoon light had taken on a different quality. It was lower now, more golden, casting longer shadows across the workshop floor. Edmund found this light more restful somehow. The harshness of midday had softened into something gentler. He returned to his stone with renewed energy. His hands were beginning to know the work. The rhythm was becoming second nature. Position, strike, listen, reposition, strike again. Around him, the other craftsmen moved through their own rhythms. An older master worked on a capital, his chisel creating intricate leaf patterns with a precision that spoke of decades of practice. Thomas moved methodically through his window frame, each cut deliberately placed to support the weight of the stone above it. Guillaume worked at the main design table, carefully measuring a new section of the cathedral's floor plan. Edmund watched him from his place, seeing how the older man's hands moved with absolute certainty, how his eyes examined every detail of the design. This, too, was part of the craft, not just the physical shaping of stone, but the understanding of how stones fit together, how weight is distributed, how a structure could stand for centuries if every piece was placed with precision and care. As the afternoon deepened, Edmund became aware of a profound quietness in the workshop. Not silence. There were sounds all around him, the constant gentle percussion of work, but a kind of quietness of the mind. His thoughts were still. There was only the stone, his hands, the tools, the rhythm. Time seemed to have a different quality here, slower and more spacious. He found himself thinking of the cathedral itself, the great structure that rose above this workshop. Every stone that he and the other craftsmen shaped here would eventually become part of that building. His small piece of decorative molding would fit into some arch and would be seen by people for centuries to come. The thought should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt peaceful. He was part of something much larger than himself, something that would outlast him by hundreds of years. When the bells rang for vespers, Edmund was almost surprised at how quickly the afternoon had passed. His stone had progressed significantly. The decorative pattern was now clearly visible, the channels he had carved creating a pattern that Guillaume had described as a river flowing through the stone. Looking at it now, Edmund could see it. The way the lines suggested movement, flow, a kind of gentle energy captured in the solid limestone. The craftsmen set down their tools with the same care they brought to everything. Guillaume extinguished the braziers and the workshop grew cooler. The stones rested, waiting patiently for the next day's work. In the cathedral, the evening prayers unfolded with the same timeless rhythm they had the night before. Edmund knelt in the cool air, his hands at rest now, but still holding the memory of the day's work. The candles bloomed in the growing darkness, and the monks' voices rose in their Latin chants. The light fell through the high windows in fatting columns of amber and rose. When the prayers ended, Edmund lingered for a moment, looking up at the stone vault of the ceiling. Somewhere in this cathedral, craftsmen like Guillaume had shaped stones, fitted them together and created this space of soaring beauty. The work they had done centuries ago still stood. The stones they had shaped still held their weight, still supporting the structure above them. That was immortality of a kind, not of one's name but of one's work, persisting quietly through the centuries. Back in the craftsman's quarters, Edmund lay in darkness again, but tonight his body felt different. His hands ached pleasantly, not with pain but with the deep satisfaction of honest work. His shoulders carried the warmth of the day's exertion. His mind was quiet in a way that spoke to the fundamental peace of his work. Tomorrow would bring the same bell, the same workshop, the same stone waiting for his hands, and the day after that, and many days after that. The pattern would continue, unfolding slowly, each day adding to the work, each season bringing new skills, new understanding. Guillaume had mentioned that it would take 5 years, perhaps more, before Edmund would be considered a true craftsman. 5 years of this rhythm, this peace, this gradual unfolding. Edmund found himself content with that time frame. There was no hurry. The stone would still be there tomorrow. The cathedral would still be rising, stone by stone, year by year. He was part of the process now, his hands adding their contribution to something that would outlast him. His breathing deepened as sleep approached. He could hear one of his roommates, the third apprentice, a quiet boy named Peter, already breathing in the rhythm of deep sleep. The other bed was empty. That apprentice worked the night watch at the cathedral. The rhythm of the workshop continued even when Edmund slept, the building never truly resting, always in some state of becoming. In the darkness, Edmund's mind released its hold on the day. The stone dust that had settled in his hair and on his clothes seemed to carry the weight of centuries. His hands, marked now with the first signs of the craftsman he was becoming, lay peaceful on his blanket. The bells of the cathedral told the hour somewhere in the distance, their sound carrying across the night air. Edmund, 17 years old with his growing calluses and his deepening understanding of the craft, drifted into sleep. Tomorrow the stone will be waiting. The work would continue, and with each day his hands would know more, his understanding would deepen, and he would move gradually, peacefully, toward mastery. The night held him gently as he slept, and the cathedral stood vast and patient around him, stone upon stone, built by hands like his own, built to last forever. Edmund woke on a morning when frost had come to the courtyard. The grass beyond the workshop windows glimmered with silver, and the air that drifted through the open archway carried the sharp cleanness of autumn turning toward winter. He dressed quickly, pulling on an extra woolen layer beneath his tunic. The work would warm him soon enough, but the morning cold was a new challenge he had not yet faced in his apprenticeship. Guillaume was already in the workshop when Edmund arrived, and the older craftsman had prepared hot water in a large pot near the braziers. He looked at Edmund with quiet understanding, seeing in the boy's quick movements the adjustment to the changing season. "Frost is coming earlier this year," Guillaume said, his weathered hands occupied with setting out the tools. "The work changes slightly in the cold months. The stone becomes harder, more brittle. Your strikes must be more precise, less forceful. The stone will tell you it's cold by its resistance. Listen carefully." Edmund nodded, understanding that this was a new lesson being offered. The craft would have seasons, would demand different approaches as the weather shifted. He had been working in the gentle autumn for 3 weeks now. He had not yet experienced the challenge of winter stone. He made his way to his work table where his decorative molding waited. The limestone felt colder than usual, its surface slick with the faint moisture of the frost. He wrapped his hands around it for a moment, feeling the chill seep into his palms. Then he selected a chisel and positioned it carefully, mindful of Guillaume's instruction. The first strike was gentle, exploratory. The stone responded with a sharper crack than it had in the warmer days. He adjusted immediately, understanding without being told that this stone needed gentleness more than force. Thomas was already working at his window frame, his movements carrying the confidence of a boy who had worked through at least one winter already. He worked with the same rhythm as always, but Edmund could see that his strikes were indeed more controlled, more thoughtful than they had been in the previous days. The morning progressed with Edmund learning through his hands and through careful observation. The stone was different, yes, but the fundamentals remained the same. Listen, feel, respond. The cold made the work slower, but not in a way that felt rushed. If anything, the frost seemed to deepen the quietness of the workshop. The sounds of the chisels and hammers seemed to carry differently in the colder air, traveling farther, echoing slightly off the high stone ceiling. By midday, when the rest bell rang, Edmund had made steady progress despite the adjusted technique. The decorative pattern was nearly complete now. He could see the full design emerging, the river flowing through stone, the pattern that Guillaume had guided him to understand. Another week or two of careful work, and the piece would be ready for Guillaume to examine and approve. In the eating room, the bread was thicker today, more substantial, and there was hot broth, a thin pottage with dried herbs and barley. The warmth of it in Edmund's hands was welcome. He sat beside Thomas again, and the older apprentice studied the younger boy with the kind of assessment that came from understanding the craft himself. "You're adjusting well to the cold," Thomas said. "I remember when I first experienced frost stone. I fought it for 3 days before understanding that it required a different approach. You learned it in one morning." "Guillaume is a good teacher," Edmund replied, sipping the broth. It was flavored with sage and thyme, and the warmth spread through his chest. "He is," Thomas agreed. "But he can only teach you what your hands are willing to learn. Some apprentices never adjust to the stone's changes. They keep trying to force the old techniques into new seasons. Those are the ones who break the stone and waste months of work." Edmund considered this as he ate. The stone was a teacher then, as much as Guillaume was. The craft required listening not just to human instruction, but to the material itself, to its moods and seasons, to its particular nature in cold and heat and the changing light. After the meal, the afternoon work resumed. The light today was particularly beautiful, the winter sun lower in the sky, turning everything golden and amber. The shadows in the workshop were longer and deeper than they had been in the autumn weeks. Edmund found this light restful in a different way than the autumn light had been. There was something about the low angle that seemed to encourage slowness, contemplation. As the afternoon deepened, a visitor came to the workshop. He was a man Edmund had not seen before, tall and dressed in the fine wool of a merchant or minor noble. Guillaume greeted him with respect but without ceremony, and the two men moved to the design table where the cathedral's plans were laid out. Edmund watched from his place as Guillaume pointed out various sections of the work, explaining the progress. The visitor nodded, his eyes examining the plans with interest. The conversation was too quiet for Edmund to hear clearly, but he caught fragments. The western arch, the new ribbing, by spring if the weather permits. The visitor studied a particular drawing for a long time, then turned to look out at the workshop floor where the apprentices and craftsmen were working. His gaze passed over Thomas, over the older master at his capital, and came to rest on Edmund. For a moment, the two looked at each other across the space. Edmund felt suddenly aware of the dust in his hair, the calluses beginning to form on his hands, the simple wool of his apprentice's clothes. But the visitor's expression was not dismissive. If anything, there was something like approval in his gaze, the recognition of a boy learning a craft, contributing to something larger than himself. Then the moment passed. The visitor turned back to Guillaume, and their quiet conversation continued. After the visitor departed, Guillaume made no mention of the exchange. But as the afternoon work continued, he came to Edmund's table and stood for a moment, observing the progress on the decorative molding. "That was Master Claude," Guillaume said quietly. "He oversees all the cathedral construction projects for the bishop. He is pleased with the progress we're making. In the spring, when the weather permits more intensive work, there will be much to do." Edmund felt a small warmth bloom in his chest at this information. The work he was doing, the stone he was shaping, had caught the attention of someone important. It mattered. His efforts were part of something that people cared about, that they watched over, that they planned for and invested in. "How long have you been working on the cathedral?" Edmund asked, the question emerging before he had fully formed it. Guillaume was quiet for a moment, considering. 23 years now. I came as an apprentice myself, much as you have. The cathedral has grown slowly during that time, as it should. Some days I work on stones that will be placed years from now, after I am gone. The building will outlast us both, Edmund. That is the nature of cathedral work. You are part of something that will be standing when your grandchildren are old. This thought settled into Edmund like a stone dropped into still water. 23 years. He was only 3 weeks into an apprenticeship that might last 5 years or more. And after that, there would be decades of work, building slowly, contributing to the rising stone structure that grew year by year toward completion. As the afternoon light continued its slow descent toward evening, Edmund returned to his work with a new sense of purpose. Not urgency. The craft demanded no urgency, but a deeper understanding of why patience was necessary, why each stone had to be shaped with such care. The cathedral was not being rushed into existence. It was unfolding as it should in the time it required, with each craftsman contributing their skill and their years. When the bells rang for vespers, Edmund set down his tools with the usual care. The stone would rest through the night. Tomorrow it would be waiting, cold and patient, for his hands to resume the work. In the cathedral, Edmund knelt in the cool air and listened to the evening prayers. The light was fading quickly now, the frost-touched darkness arriving earlier than it had in the weeks before. The candles seemed brighter because of it, their flames more vivid in the deepening shadow. The high windows had turned a deep blue-gray, the last light of the day barely reaching the upper reaches of the stone vault. He thought of the visitor, Master Claude, and of Guillaume's words. The building would outlast them all. The stones would stand for centuries. In that continuity, there was a kind of peace that Edmund was only beginning to understand. He was not rushing toward anything. He was not competing with anyone. He was simply, day by day, week by week, learning a craft that would allow him to contribute to something vast and enduring. Back in the craftsman's quarters, Edmund lay in darkness as the night deepened. His hands ached pleasantly, and the cold of the frost-touched day had created a different quality of tiredness than the warm autumn work had produced. His body felt heavier, more grounded. The approaching winter would bring changes, but the work would continue. The stone would continue. The cathedral would continue to rise. Tomorrow there will be frost again, perhaps deeper than today. The stone would be colder still, and Edmund would listen to it, adjust his technique as needed, and continue the slow unfolding of his craft. In 5 years or 10 or 20, he would be like Guillaume, weathered, capable, patient. He would have trained other apprentices. He would have shaped thousands of stones. His hands would carry the marks of a lifetime's work. But that was far in the future. Tonight, he was 17 years old, 3 weeks into his apprenticeship, with calluses beginning to form on his palms, and the knowledge that the work stretched before him like a long road, peaceful and unhurried, leading toward mastery. The darkness held him gently. The frost glittered on the courtyard beyond the dormitory walls. And Edmund, his mind releasing its hold on thought, drifted into the deep sleep of honest labor, his hands at rest but still remembering the shape of the stone, the weight of the chisel, the quiet rhythm of the craft. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, a structure of stone and time, built by hands like his own, built to last forever. Edmund woke to the sound of rain on the workshop roof. It was a gentle sound, steady and soothing, the kind of rain that spoke of winter settling in with patience rather than violence. Gray light filled the dormitory, and he lay for a moment listening to the rhythm of the water, feeling the slight chill that came with the changing season. When he made his way to the workshop, he found Guillaume already there, standing near the entrance and watching the rain fall across the courtyard. The older craftsman's graying brown hair was slightly damp, suggesting he had been out in the weather already, inspecting something. He turned as Edmund entered, and his weathered face held a quiet satisfaction. "The rain is good," Guillaume said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had worked through many winters. "It keeps the stone from drying too quickly. In cold weather, if the stone dries too fast, it can crack. The rain is a gift, though most people don't understand that." Edmund nodded, understanding that this was another lesson in the hidden knowledge of the craft. The stone had its seasons, its moods, its particular needs. Rain was not an obstacle but a necessary part of the process. He set about preparing his workspace, arranging his tools with the practiced care that had become second nature over the past weeks. Thomas arrived shortly after, and the 2 apprentices exchanged a quiet greeting. The older boy's movements carried the ease of someone who had worked through this transition before. He seemed to understand rain stone in the same way he understood frost stone, not as a problem, but as a simple variation in the work's rhythm. The morning light was softer than usual, filtered through the rain and the gray sky beyond. The workshop felt enclosed, held in a gentle cocoon of sound and shadow. The scent of the stone seemed deeper in this weather, more earthy, as if the rain had awakened something in the ancient limestone. Edmund began his work on the decorative molding, which was now nearing completion. The pattern was clear and beautiful, the river flowing through stone, exactly as Guillaume had guided him to create it. The few remaining sections required careful, precise work. The rain had made the stone slightly slicker, and each strike with the chisel demanded more attention than usual. Around him, the workshop continued its quiet rhythm. An older master worked on a new capital, his hands moving with the precision that came from decades of practice. His movements were so economical, so assured, that they seemed to flow like water themselves, each strike in exactly the right place, each adjustment minimal and perfect. Guillaume moved between the craftsmen, offering guidance where needed. With Edmund, he paused to examine the nearly completed molding, running his work-reddened fingers along the carved channels. He was a patient man, Edmund had learned, but also a meticulous one. Nothing passed his inspection without careful consideration. "This is good work," Guillaume said, and Edmund felt the warmth of genuine approval. "You have listened to the stone well. The pattern is even, the depth consistent. In another week, this piece will be ready for the masons." The mention of the masons brought a new dimension to Edmund's understanding. His work would be passed on to other craftsmen, who would fit it into the larger structure. The decorative molding he was creating would become part of an arch, would support weight, and would endure for centuries. The knowledge settled into him like a stone finding its proper place in a foundation. By midday, when the rain had grown heavier, the workshop bell rang for the rest period. The craftsmen gathered in the eating room, where the kitchens had prepared a hearty pottage with onions and herbs, thick bread and small beer to warm the belly. The air in the room was warm and close, comforting in contrast to the cold, wet weather beyond. Edmund sat with Thomas, and the older apprentice seemed in a talkative mood. Perhaps it was the rain, perhaps the enclosure of the workshop creating intimacy, but Thomas began to speak of his own journey into the craft. "I came to Guillaume when I was 16, Thomas said, his hands occupied with breaking apart his bread. "My father was a mason, and he thought I should learn stone cutting to understand the work better. I was resentful at first. I wanted to do the more visible work, the actual building. But Guillaume taught me that the shaping is everything. The masons can only place the stones we prepare. The quality of the final structure depends on how well we do this work." Edmund listened, understanding that Thomas was offering him wisdom earned through his own early resistance and eventual acceptance. "Now," Thomas continued, "I wouldn't choose any other work. There's a piece in it that I don't think I would find anywhere else. Each stone you shape teaches you something. The craft is old, Edmund. Craftsmen like us have been shaping stone for centuries. You're part of a long line of hands doing this same work." This resonated deeply with Edmund. He thought of the visitor, Master Claude, and of Guillaume's mention of stones being shaped years before they were placed. The craft existed outside of time in a way, the techniques unchanged for centuries. The patience demanded the same, the slow unfolding of skill identical to what apprentices had experienced for generations. "How much longer until you're considered a master?" Edmund asked. "Another 2 years, probably," Thomas replied. "Guillaume says I'm ready to begin the more complex arches soon. Once I can shape those without guidance, then I'll be close to finishing my apprenticeship. But even after that, I'll keep learning. The craft never stops teaching you." After the meal, the craftsmen returned to work. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof, and somehow the sound seemed to deepen the quietness of the workshop rather than interrupt it. Edmund found himself in that meditative state that the work induced. Time seemed to move differently, more slowly, more spaciously. The afternoon stretched out like honey pouring from a jar, and he moved through it with a kind of grace that surprised him. He completed the last major section of his decorative molding. The pattern was fully visible now, a river of stone, flowing endlessly in carefully carved channels. It was beautiful in a way that Edmund was only beginning to understand. Not beautiful in the way a jewel is beautiful, but beautiful in the way a well-made thing is beautiful, truthful, honest, created with patience and care. Guillaume came to examine it as the afternoon deepened. He studied the work from several angles, running his hands along the carved surfaces with the tenderness of a man examining something precious. He said nothing for a long moment, and Edmund felt a small flutter of uncertainty. Was something wrong? Had he made an error? Then Guillaume smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face into something warm and approving. "This is excellent work, Edmund. You have the gift for this craft, I can tell. The stone speaks to you and you listen. Not every apprentice has this. Some learn the technique but never develop the understanding. You have both." Edmund felt warmth spread through his chest. The praise was measured, genuine, earned. It meant something because Guillaume did not offer empty compliments. "Next week," Guillaume continued, "I will begin teaching you the techniques for curved work. The arches require different approaches. The angles change constantly as you move around the curve. It is more complex but also more interesting. Are you ready?" "Yes," Edmund said, and meant it with every part of his being. As the afternoon light continued to fade, the rain began to ease. By the time the bells rang for vespers, the worst of the weather had passed, though the courtyard remained wet and gleaming. The clouds were beginning to break apart, showing hints of clearer sky beyond. In the cathedral, Edmund knelt in the cool air and listened to the evening prayers. The light was different after rain, cleaner somehow, sharper. The candles seemed brighter. The stone of the cathedral itself felt fresher, as if the rain had renewed it. He looked up at the vault of the ceiling and thought of the craftsmen who had shaped those stones, the patience they had brought to their work, the skill that allowed such a structure to stand. He was part of that tradition now. In 5 years, in 10, in 20, he would be shaping the arches that would support the weight of the cathedral's upper reaches. His hands would know the techniques that Guillaume was preparing to teach him. He would move through the craft with the same quiet confidence that the older craftsmen carried. But that was in the future. Tonight, he was 17 years old, 4 weeks into his apprenticeship, with his decorative molding nearing completion and the knowledge that new work was waiting. New challenges, new opportunities to listen to the stone and let it teach him. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness as the night deepened. The rain had stopped completely now, and the air had that particular quality that comes after weather, clean, refreshed, holding the memory of water and wind. His hands ached pleasantly, satisfied with a day's good work. His mind was quiet, content. Tomorrow will bring new lessons. The curved work that Guillaume had mentioned, the techniques for shaping arches, the next phase of his gradual journey toward mastery. But for now, there was only the darkness, the piece of honest labor completed, the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, learning exactly what he needed to learn. The cathedral stood above him, patient and ancient, waiting for the stones that craftsmen like him would shape and place. The work would continue. The craft would persist. And Edmund, with his growing calluses and his deepening understanding, was becoming part of the eternal rhythm of creation, slow, patient, enduring. His breathing deepened as sleep approached. The rain had watered the earth. The stones had been blessed by the sky, and tomorrow, fresh and renewed, the work will continue. Edmund woke to morning bells and the clear light of a day after rain. The frost had returned in the night, creating patterns on the dormitory windows that caught the pale dawn light like intricate lace. He dressed quickly, pulling on his wool layers, and made his way to the workshop with a sense of anticipation he had not felt before. Today, Guillaume would begin teaching him the curved work, the arches. The workshop was warm when he arrived, the braziers already lit. Guillaume stood at the design table with a new parchment spread before him, and he looked up as Edmund entered. The older craftsman's eyes held a particular brightness this morning, the kind of quiet enthusiasm that came from preparing to teach something significant. "Come," Guillaume said, gesturing Edmund forward. "Before you begin working on stone, you must understand the geometry. The arch is the strongest shape that stone can take. It distributes weight in a way that lets a building stand for centuries. But to create an arch, you must first understand how the curve works." Edmund approached the table, and Guillaume pointed to the drawing. It showed the curved form of an arch, with careful measurements marked along its length. The older craftsman's work-reddened finger traced the curve, explaining how each stone must be slightly different from the one beside it, how the angle changed gradually as you moved around the curve. "Imagine water flowing," Guillaume said, his patient voice carrying the certainty of someone who had explained this countless times. "The water follows the shape naturally, doesn't it? The stones in an arch must do the same. Follow the curve naturally, supporting each other, creating strength through the shared burden of weight." Edmund studied the drawing, trying to absorb not just the technical information, but the philosophy Guillaume was offering. The arch was not fighting against its own weight. It was embracing it, using it, turning burden into strength through the careful shaping and placement of each stone. "I will show you a practice piece first," Guillaume continued. "Then, when you understand the motion of your hands, we will move to the actual stones for the cathedral." He led Edmund to a corner of the workshop, where a partially completed curved stone sat on a bench. It was smaller than the pieces that would eventually be placed in the actual archway, a training piece designed specifically to teach the principles of curved work. Guillaume picked up a chisel specially shaped for curved work, different from the straight chisels Edmund had been using. This one had a slightly curved blade, designed to follow the arc of the stone's surface. The older craftsman positioned it carefully and struck with perfect precision. The stone yielded, a small channel appearing that followed the intended curve. "Feel the angle," Guillaume said, and Edmund stepped closer, watching. The chisel is not perpendicular to the surface, but slightly angled to follow the curve. As you move around the stone, the angle changes. Your hands must feel this change and must adjust without thinking about it. This is where true craftsmanship begins. He demonstrated 3 times, each strike creating a small channel that followed the intended arc perfectly. Then he set down the tools and looked at Edmund with quiet expectation. "Now you try." Edmund's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the curved chisel. It felt strange in his grip, subtly different from the straight tools he had been using. He positioned it on the stone, trying to remember the angle Guillaume had demonstrated, trying to feel the intention in his hands. His first strike was uncertain, and the channel that appeared was slightly off the intended curve. He could feel the mistake immediately. Guillaume said nothing, but his silence was instructive. Edmund adjusted his approach for the next strike, angling the chisel slightly differently. This time, the channel was truer. The morning unfolded in this way: repetition, adjustment, gradual refinement. Edmund worked under Guillaume's watchful eye, making perhaps 50 strikes on the practice stone, learning through his hands the subtle adjustments required to follow a curve. The older craftsman offered minimal commentary, allowing Edmund's own experience to be the teacher. By midday, Edmund's hands had begun to understand the motion. The adjustments were becoming more intuitive, less deliberate. He could feel the difference between a strike that followed the curve and one that deviated from it. Thomas came to observe for a few moments during the rest period, and he watched Edmund's work with the knowing appreciation of someone who had recently made the same transition. "It's strange at first," Thomas said quietly. "Your mind tries to calculate the angles, but that's too slow. You have to let your hands learn it instead. In another week, you won't think about it at all. Your hands will just know." After the meal, Edmund returned to the practice stone with renewed determination. The afternoon light was clear and strong, the winter sun low but bright, casting sharp shadows across the workshop floor. The stone seemed to glow in this light, its pale surface showing clearly where the curves were true and where they wavered slightly. Guillaume worked nearby on a section of the cathedral's actual floor plan, but his attention remained subtly aware of Edmund's progress. Edmund could feel this attention, not as pressure, but as a kind of supportive presence. The older craftsman was there if needed, but the work was Edmund's to do. As the afternoon deepened, Edmund began to experience the state of flow that he had first discovered weeks ago with the straight work. His mind quieted. The world narrowed to the stone, his hands, the chisel, the hammer. The curve became real to him, not a geometric abstraction, but a living thing that his hands could follow and support. He completed perhaps a quarter of the practice stone's intended curve by the time the bells rang for vespers. When he set down his tools and stepped back to examine the work, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple progress. He was beginning to understand something fundamental about the craft. The stone was not an obstacle. It was a partner in the creation, teaching him through its resistance, its yielding, its particular nature. Guillaume came to examine the work as Edmund was setting aside his tools. The older craftsman ran his hand along the curved channels, feeling their consistency, their truth. He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "You have the instinct for this. In another week we will begin on the actual arch stones, but for now rest. Your hands have learned much today." In the cathedral, Edmund knelt in the cool evening air and listened to the prayers. The candlelight seemed softer than usual, and the stone vault above held a particular grace. He thought of the arches that would eventually support that ceiling, arches that craftsmen like him would shape, stone by stone, each one slightly different from the last, all of them working together to create strength. The work was becoming clearer to him. It was not about individual stones, but about how stones work together. The decorative molding he had completed was beautiful, but it was solitary in its purpose. The arches would be different. They would be part of a system, supporting weight, creating strength through collaboration. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness and thought about the day. His hands still held the memory of the curved chisel, the adjusted angles, the way his body had gradually learned to make the subtle shifts required to follow the curve. Tomorrow he will continue on the practice stone. In a week or so, he would begin on the actual arch stones that would go into the cathedral. The timeline was accelerating. What had seemed impossibly distant a few weeks ago, the moment when he would work on the arches, was now approaching with surprising speed. But there was no anxiety in this thought, only a kind of peaceful anticipation. He was ready for this work. His hands had prepared him. His mind had learned the patience it required. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, vast and patient, its arches holding weight and strength, created by craftsmen like him, sustained by patience and skill and careful attention to the nature of stone. Edmund's breathing deepened, his hands relaxed, and sleep came gently, carrying him toward tomorrow's lessons, toward the next phase of his gradual journey into mastery. The work would continue. The stone would teach. The craft would unfold, one strike at a time, one curve at a time, in the patient rhythm that had sustained cathedral building for centuries. Edmund woke to the sound of the workshop bell and lay for a moment in the quiet darkness of the dormitory, listening to the rhythm of his roommate's breathing. 2 weeks had passed since Guillaume had first shown him the curved work. 2 weeks of practicing on the smaller stone, of learning through repetition and gentle correction, of allowing his hands to absorb knowledge that his mind could not fully articulate. Today would be different. Today, Guillaume had said, they would begin on the actual arch stones. He dressed in the cold air, pulling on his wool layers, and made his way through the pre-dawn darkness toward the workshop. A thin moon hung in the sky, pale and distant, and the frost glittered on the stone courtyard beneath his feet. The air was sharp, carrying the particular quality of deep winter, the kind of cold that came with stillness, with quiet. The workshop was already warm when he arrived. Guillaume stood near the entrance, watching the darkness slowly give way to the gray light of approaching dawn. The older craftsman turned as Edmund entered, and his weathered face held a particular solemnity. "Today is an important day," Guillaume said quietly. "You will work on stone that will go into the cathedral itself. The practice is finished. Now begins the real work." A new stone sat on the main work table, larger than the practice piece, but not so large as to be overwhelming. It was pale limestone, beautiful in its simplicity, waiting for Edmund's hands to shape it. Guillaume had already marked the intended curve on its surface, a thin line of chalk showing where the chisel should travel. "This is the first of 12 stones that will form one arch," Guillaume explained, and Edmund felt the weight of that statement. 12 stones, each one carefully shaped, each one slightly different from the last, all of them working together to create an arch that would stand for centuries, that would support the weight of the cathedral above it. "I will not guide you as closely as I did with the practice stone," Guillaume continued. "You have learned what you need to learn. Now you must trust your hands. I will observe, and if you begin to deviate significantly from the intended curve, I will intervene. But the work must be yours." Edmund approached the stone with a respect that went beyond anything he had felt before. This stone mattered. It was not practice. It was not preparation. It was the real work, the actual creation that would become part of the cathedral. He selected his curved chisel carefully, feeling its weight in his hand. The tool had become familiar over the past 2 weeks, but today it felt new again, charged with significance. He positioned the chisel on the stone, aligned with the chalk mark, and paused for a moment to feel the angle, to remind his hands what they had learned. Then he struck. The stone yielded perfectly. The channel that appeared followed the chalk line with precision. Edmund felt a surge of quiet confidence. His hands knew this work. They had been preparing for it. The morning unfolded in deep concentration. The workshop around him seemed to fade into the background. The sounds of other craftsmen, the ambient noise, the light shifting gradually from gray to pale gold. There was only the stone, his hands, the chisel, the hammer, the curve that he was gradually revealing from the pale limestone. Guillaume moved past several times but said nothing. Edmund could sense his approval in the silence, in the way the older craftsman occasionally paused to examine the work before moving on. No corrections came, no interventions. Just the quiet observation of a master watching an apprentice claim mastery of their own. Thomas arrived as the morning was well advanced and worked on his own arch stone at a nearby table. The 2 young men did not speak. There was no need for words in the workshop. Their shared understanding of the work created a kind of silent communion. They were both engaged in the same process, both learning from the stone, both contributing to the cathedral that would outlast them both. By midday, Edmund had completed approximately half of the first arch stone's curve. The progression was beautiful to see, the gradually changing angles following the mathematical precision of the arc, each strike building on the last, each adjustment so subtle that only a trained eye would notice the refinement. In the eating room, Edmund sat with Thomas and another apprentice, a boy named Robert who was perhaps a year younger than Edmund and had arrived at the workshop only a few weeks prior. Robert watched Edmund with something like awe. "Is it hard?" Robert asked, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone just beginning. "The curved work." "It was," Edmund said honestly, "but Guillaume teaches slowly. By the time he puts you on the real stones, your hands already know what to do. The secret is to listen to the stone. Let it teach you." Robert nodded seriously, absorbing this wisdom. Edmund realized that he was already becoming the kind of older apprentice that Thomas had been to him, the one who could offer guidance, who had moved beyond the early struggles into genuine competence. The thought was both humbling and deeply satisfying. After the meal, Edmund returned to his stone with the afternoon light streaming through the workshop windows. The low winter sun created long shadows across the work surface, making the curve he was creating even more visible. Each shadow showed where the stone was true and where it wavered slightly. Guillaume appeared as the afternoon deepened, and for the first time since the morning had begun, he spoke to Edmund about the work. "You are ready for the remaining stones," the older craftsman said quietly. "After this one, I will move you to the next arch piece. You will work faster now. Your hands have learned the motion. By spring, when the weather permits more intensive work, you will have completed several arches." Edmund looked up from his work, and Guillaume's weathered face held a particular warmth. The older man was a patient man. Edmund had learned over the weeks, but also someone who recognized true progress when he saw it. "You have the gift for this work," Guillaume said again, the words he had spoken once before but which now carried the weight of genuine knowledge earned through observation. "I knew it from the beginning, but I wanted to be certain. Now I am. You will become a master craftsman, Edmund. The cathedral will benefit from your hands for many decades to come." Edmund felt something shift in his understanding. This was not simply learning a trade. This was being called into a vocation, recognized as someone who belonged to the craft. The weight of that recognition was profound but not burdensome. It felt like coming home, like finding the place where his hands were meant to work, where his life would have meaning and purpose. As the afternoon light continued its gradual descent toward evening, Edmund worked with renewed focus. The last sections of the arch stone's curve demanded his complete attention, but his hands moved with confidence now. He was no longer learning. He was working. He was creating. When the bells rang for vespers, Edmund set down his tools with the careful reverence that had become habitual. The stone would rest through the night. His work will continue tomorrow. But for now, the first arch stone was nearly complete, ready for Guillaume's final inspection and approval. In the cathedral, Edmund knelt in the cool evening air, and something felt different. He was not simply a worshiper in this space anymore. He was a co-creator of it. The stones he would shape would become part of this beauty, this grace, this soaring structure that invited the soul toward contemplation of something larger than itself. The candlelight flickered, and the shadows danced across the stone vault. Somewhere in that vault were arches shaped by craftsmen from generations past. Arches that had held their weight for centuries, that would continue to hold it for centuries more. And soon, his arches would be among them. His hands would contribute to the eternal structure. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness as the deep peace of purposeful work settled over him. His hands ached pleasantly, satisfied. His mind was quiet, centered. He had moved beyond apprenticeship into something more, into genuine work, into creation that mattered. The weeks ahead would bring more arch stones, more learning, more gradual refinement of his craft, but the fundamental shift had occurred. He was no longer uncertain about his place here. He was no longer learning whether he belonged. He belonged. The craft had claimed him, and he had claimed the craft in return. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, patient and ancient, waiting for the stones that craftsmen like him would shape and place. The work would continue. The craft would persist through centuries. And Edmund, with his capable hands and his growing mastery, was becoming part of that eternal rhythm. His breathing deepened as sleep approached. Tomorrow there will be another arch stone waiting, and after that another, and many more after that. The work stretched before him like a long road, peaceful and unhurried, leading toward a mastery that would take years to fully achieve, but which was now, unmistakably, within reach. The frost glittered on the courtyard beyond the dormitory walls. The cathedral stood vast and patient. And Edmund, 17 years old, 1 month into his apprenticeship, drifted into sleep knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged. The stone would teach him for the rest of his life, and he would listen, stone by stone, curve by curve, in the patient rhythm of creation that had sustained the craft for centuries. Edmund woke to the sound of bells marking the hour before dawn. The dormitory was still dark, but he was awake immediately, his mind already moving toward the work waiting in the workshop. The arch stones had become the center of his existence now, not in any anxious way, but in the deep, peaceful way that comes when your purpose is clear and your hands know what they must do. He dressed quickly in the pre-dawn cold and made his way across the frost-covered courtyard. The stars were still visible overhead, pale points of light in the dark sky. His breath came in small clouds of vapor. The world felt held in quiet suspension, waiting for the day to begin. Guillaume was already in the workshop, as he often was these early mornings. The older craftsman had the fire going, and the space held the warmth and comfort of the braziers. He looked up as Edmund entered, and his weathered face held its customary quiet approval. "The second stone is ready," Guillaume said. "This one will be slightly different in curve from the first. The angle changes as you progress around the arch. Are you ready to learn the adjustment?" Edmund approached the new stone, which sat on the main work table. It was similar in size to the first, but when he studied it carefully, he could see that the chalk mark indicating the intended curve was subtly different. The angle slightly steeper, the radius of curvature marginally tighter. "Each stone in the arch must be different," Guillaume explained, his patient voice carrying the weight of knowledge earned through decades of practice. "The arch is not a perfect circle, you see. It is more complex than that. The stones must transition gradually from one angle to the next, so that when they are placed together, they create a unified curve that distributes weight perfectly. Guillaume showed him the mathematical principle using a simple drawing, how the angle changed slightly from stone to stone, how this gradual transition created the strength of the arch. It was complex information, but Guillaume explained it with such clarity and calm that Edmund's mind accepted it without struggle. Your hands already understand this from working the practice stone, Guillaume continued. Now you must understand it with your mind as well. Knowledge lives in two places, in your hands and in your mind. A true craftsman integrates both. The morning progressed as Edmund began the second arch stone. The work was similar to the first in technique, but different in execution. The adjusted angle required a subtle shift in how he positioned the chisel, how he angled his strikes. It was the kind of difference that would have been invisible to a casual observer, but which Edmund could feel immediately in his hands. Thomas worked nearby on his third arch stone, and there was a companionable rhythm to their shared labor. Two young men, at slightly different stages of mastery, both engaged in the same fundamental work. The workshop held them both gently, and the stones taught them both their respective lessons. By midday, Edmund had established the curve for the second stone. The work was progressing faster than it had with the first. His hands were already more confident, already understanding the motion more completely. Guillaume examined it briefly during the rest period and offered a simple nod of approval before returning to the design table. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors to the workshop. Master Claude returned, and with him came a man Edmund had not seen before, an older gentleman dressed in the fine wool of high rank. Guillaume greeted them with respect and led them to the design table, where the cathedral's plans were laid out. Edmund worked steadily at his arch stone while the visitors examined the plans. The older man, who Guillaume addressed as "My Lord Bishop," studied the drawings with careful attention. His eyes occasionally swept across the workshop, observing the craftsmen at their work. When his gaze reached Edmund, it paused for a moment. The bishop was a patient observer, Edmund noted. He did not interrupt or hurry the examination. He simply looked, understood, and moved on. There was something about his presence that suggested a deep understanding of what the cathedral meant, not just as a religious structure, but as an embodiment of community commitment, skill, and faith all working together. After the visitors departed, Guillaume came to Edmund's table and stood for a moment without speaking. "The bishop is pleased with our progress," Guillaume said finally. "He mentioned specifically that the quality of our stonework is exceptional. He knows that good architecture begins with good craft at the foundation level. Your work contributes to that reputation." Edmund felt warmth spread through his chest at these words. His individual efforts, the countless strikes with the chisel, the careful attention to the curve, all of it was contributing to something that the bishop himself recognized and valued. The work mattered, not just to Guillaume, not just to Edmund himself, but to the broader community that depended on this cathedral. As the afternoon deepened, Edmund found himself working with a kind of quiet joy that had not been present in the earlier weeks. The fear of failure had completely dissolved. He was not learning anymore in any fundamental sense. His hands knew what they needed to know. He was simply, day by day, creating stones that would become part of the cathedral's eternal structure. The light shifted as the winter day progressed toward its early evening. The low sun cast long shadows across the workshop, and the pale limestone of the arched stone seemed to glow in the golden light. Edmund worked steadily, aware of his breathing, aware of the rhythm of his strikes, aware of the gradual revealing of the curve from within the stone. Around him, the workshop continued its timeless rhythm. The older master worked on another capital, his hands moving with the economy of motion that came from a lifetime of practice. Thomas worked steadily on his own stone. Young Robert, the newest apprentice, practiced on smaller pieces under careful supervision. The sound of chisel and hammer created a gentle percussion that seemed to slow time itself. When the bells rang for vespers, Edmund set down his tools and stood back to examine his progress. The second archstone's curve was nearly complete, another day or two of work, and it would be ready for Guillaume's final approval. Then would come the third stone, then the fourth, then all the others in sequence until the entire arch was shaped and ready for the masons to place. In the cathedral, Edmund knelt in the evening dimness. The candlelight had begun, and the interior glowed with soft illumination. The stone vault above held the candlelight in its curves, and Edmund found himself looking at the arches with new understanding. Someone had shaped those stones, just as he was shaping his own. Someone had held a chisel just as he did, had struck it with a hammer just as he did, had listened to the stone and learned its secrets just as he was learning them now. The work was old, the work was eternal, and he was part of it. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness and felt the pleasant ache of honest labor in his hands and shoulders. His mind was quiet, satisfied. The deep winter night held the workshop in stillness, and the cathedral stood vast and patient above everything, waiting for spring when more intensive work could begin, waiting for the slow accumulation of shaped stones that would gradually, over decades, complete the structure. But for now, there was rest. There was darkness, peaceful and holding. There was the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another arch stone, another opportunity to listen to the stone and let his hands shape it according to the ancient principles of the craft. Edmund's breathing deepened, his hands relaxed, and sleep came gently, carrying him toward tomorrow's work, toward the next phase of his gradual journey into mastery. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, patient and eternal, built stone by craftsmen like him, sustained by patience and skill, and the quiet devotion of hands willing to serve something larger than themselves. The work would continue, the craft would persist, and Edmund, with his capable hands and his deepening mastery, was becoming part of the eternal structure, not as someone separate from it, but as an integral element of its creation and continuation. Edmund woke on a morning when the first hints of spring touched the air. It was subtle, a softness in the quality of the light, a slight warmth in the breeze that drifted through the dormitory window, the faintest sound of birdsong from somewhere beyond the cathedral walls. Winter had not fully released its grip, but it was loosening. He dressed and made his way to the workshop, where Guillaume stood near the entrance, also sensing the change in the season. The older craftsman's graying brown hair caught the early light as he turned to greet Edmund. "Spring is coming," Guillaume said simply. "The heavy work will begin soon. Master Claude has indicated that we will have more masons available once the weather fully turns. The stones we are shaping now will be placed within weeks." Edmund felt a particular kind of anticipation at these words. The third arch stone sat waiting on the work table, and beyond it, he could already see the shadows of the remaining 9 stones that would complete the arch. The work he was doing now would soon be visible in the actual cathedral structure. The abstract would become concrete. The shaped stones would take their places in the rising walls. The morning unfolded as most mornings did now, with Edmund working steadily on his arch stone while the workshop continued its peaceful rhythm around him. But there was something different in the quality of the light today, something that spoke of transformation beginning. The harsh clarity of winter light had given way to something gentler, more diffuse. Guillaume came to examine Edmund's progress midway through the morning, and the older craftsman spent more time than usual studying the work. His weathered hands traced the curve, feeling its consistency, its truth. "You are ready for more responsibility," Guillaume said finally. "I want you to begin training Robert. The younger apprentices need guidance from someone closer to their own experience. You understand the struggles they face in a way that I, after so many years, may have forgotten." Edmund felt a shift in his understanding of his role. He was no longer simply a learner. He was becoming a teacher. The craft was expanding to include this new dimension, the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. "Show him the foundation work," Guillaume continued. "The straight cuts, the basic techniques. Let him practice on the smaller stones, and be patient with him as I have been patient with you. Not every apprentice will have the gift for curved work, but all of them can become competent craftsmen if they are guided with care." After the midday meal, Edmund found Robert working at a smaller bench, struggling with a basic straight cut. The younger apprentice's hands were still tender, unmarked by calluses, and his technique was uncertain. Edmund approached quietly and stood for a moment, observing without comment. "May I show you something?" Edmund asked finally, and Robert looked up with gratitude clear in his young face. Edmund took a chisel and positioned it with the careful precision that had become second nature to him. "The angle is everything with the straight cuts," he said, speaking in the patient tone that Guillaume had used with him. "You want the chisel perpendicular to the surface, not angled. Feel the difference." He demonstrated the correct positioning, then set down the tools and let Robert try. The younger apprentice's first attempt was still imperfect, but Edmund could see the understanding beginning to form in his hands. "Again," Edmund said simply, "your hands will learn this through repetition. The stone will teach you." Over the following weeks, as spring gradually strengthened its hold on the world, Edmund moved between 2 roles with increasing ease. In the mornings, he continued his own arch stones. He was now working on the 5th stone in the sequence, his hands moving with complete confidence, the curve becoming second nature. In the afternoons, he guided Robert and occasionally the other younger apprentices, showing them the foundations of the craft, offering the kind of patient instruction that Guillaume offered him. Thomas had progressed even further in his own training. Guillaume had begun allowing him to work on more complex architectural elements, not just arch stones, but the decorative capitals and moldings that required more intricate carving. The older apprentice had entered that space where individual artistry could begin to emerge within the framework of traditional technique. One afternoon, as the spring light grew stronger and more constant, Master Claude returned to the workshop with two masons. They came to examine the arch stones that Edmund and Thomas had completed, assessing their quality and readiness for placement. The masons were practical men, strong-bodied and weathered from working outdoors. They handled the arch stones with respect, understanding immediately the quality of the work. One of them, an older man with the bearing of a master mason, ran his hands over Edmund's stones with particular care. "These are excellent," the master mason said to Guillaume, his voice carrying the authority of long experience. "The curves are true, the transitions between stones are perfect. Your apprentices have learned well." Edmund felt a profound satisfaction at this praise. It came from someone who would actually place these stones, who would depend on their quality to create a structure that would stand for centuries. The master mason was not offering empty compliments. He was acknowledging competence earned through careful work. "These first 5 stones can be placed within the week," the master mason continued. "We're ready to begin the western arch. If you can maintain this pace with the remaining stones, we'll have the complete arch installed by summer." After the masons departed, Guillaume gathered the apprentices together. Edmund, Thomas, Robert, and the other younger boys, in a rare moment of explicit instruction. "You are now part of something that extends beyond yourselves," Guillaume said, his weathered face holding particular gravity. "The stones you shape will outlast you by centuries. People will walk beneath the arches you create. Future craftsmen will study your work and learn from it. This is the nature of cathedral work. This is why we approach it with such care and patience." He paused, letting these words settle into the minds of his students. "Some of you will become masters, as I am. Some will remain competent journeymen, creating good work without achieving the highest mastery. Some may leave the craft entirely, choosing different paths. But regardless of what you become, you will always carry this knowledge in your hands. You will always know the satisfaction of creating something that endures." Edmund listened to these words with deep attention. He had always known, at some level, that the work was important, but hearing it expressed so explicitly, understanding that he was part of a lineage extending backward through centuries and forward into centuries yet to come, this solidified something in his understanding. As the weeks progressed, the weather grew warmer. The first leaves began to appear on the trees that bordered the cathedral grounds. The work in the workshop intensified as the masons prepared to place the first completed arch. Edmund worked on his 6th and 7th arch stones, his hands moving with complete confidence now, the technique so integrated into his being that he barely had to think about the motions. One afternoon, Guillaume came to him with unexpected news. "The bishop has asked to meet you," the older craftsman said simply. He wants to see the apprentice who shaped the first arch, tomorrow after the midday rest. Edmund felt a flutter of uncertainty at this news. The bishop was a figure of great authority and importance. Why would such a man want to meet with a young apprentice? But Guillaume's calm demeanor suggested this was not cause for anxiety. The next day, after the midday meal, Edmund was led by Guillaume to a quiet chamber near the cathedral's administrative offices. The bishop sat at a simple wooden table, dressed in his ecclesiastical robes, his aged face holding an expression of serene authority. "Edmund," the bishop said, gesturing for him to approach, "Master Guillaume speaks highly of your work. I wanted to see for myself the young man who is creating the arches that will support our cathedral for centuries to come." Edmund bowed respectfully, uncertain how to respond. The bishop rose and extended his weathered hand, and Edmund found himself shaking the hand of the highest authority in the cathedral, the man who oversaw everything, who represented the entire spiritual and administrative structure. "Your stones are excellent," the bishop said kindly. "I have examined them myself. The masons tell me they are superior in quality to most work they see. This speaks well of you and of Master Guillaume's teaching. The cathedral is blessed to have such craftsmen working on its creation." Edmund felt warmth spread through his entire being. Not pride exactly, but deep satisfaction. The work was being recognized at the highest levels. His contribution mattered not just to the immediate community of craftsmen, but to the entire cathedral structure and its purpose. "Continue your good work," the bishop said. "The cathedral needs apprentices like you, young men willing to learn patiently, willing to dedicate themselves to excellence. The craft you are learning will serve you all your life, and will serve the church and the community for centuries." Back in the workshop, Edmund's hands moved with renewed purpose through the seventh arch stone. The words the bishop had spoken seemed to confirm something that was already clear to Edmund, but which had now been validated at the highest level. He had found his vocation. This was not simply a trade or an occupation. This was his life's work, the thing his hands and his heart had been preparing him for. As spring deepened toward early summer, the first arch was placed in the cathedral. Edmund stood with Guillaume and watched as the master masons carefully positioned each stone, checking the fit, ensuring the curve was true. The 5 stones Edmund had shaped formed the central portion of the arch, and he could see how perfectly they worked together, how the transitions between stones were seamless. The master mason nodded in satisfaction as the final stone was set. "Perfect," he said simply. "The arch will stand for as long as this cathedral stands." That evening in the cathedral, Edmund knelt beneath the arch he had helped create. The stone rose above him in its perfect curve, distributing the weight of the structure above it with invisible precision. The work of his hands had become part of the eternal building. The knowledge that this arch would likely outlast him by centuries, that future generations would walk beneath it and be held safely by its strength, created a profound sense of peace in Edmund's heart. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness and felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. His hands had created something that would endure. The craft had claimed him completely, and he had given himself to it willingly. Spring had fully arrived now, bringing with it the promise of full seasons ahead, of more stones to shape, of gradual progression toward complete mastery. But for tonight, there was only rest and the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he had been made to do. The cathedral stood above him, a little more complete because of his work, a little stronger because of his hands. And Edmund, 17 years old, transformed into a young man of genuine skill and purpose, drifted toward sleep with the peace of someone who had found their true place in the world. Edmund woke to the sound of morning birds and the warmth of early summer light filtering through the dormitory window. He lay for a moment, listening to the particular quality of the day, the softness in the air, the richness of birdsong, the sense of the world fully awake and alive after the long winter's sleep. It had been 2 months since the first arch had been placed. 2 months of steady work, of continued learning, of gradually deepening mastery. Edmund had completed all 12 stones of the first arch, and Guillaume had already assigned him to begin work on a second arch, a more complex one that would require even greater precision. He dressed and made his way across the courtyard, where the morning was alive with activity. The cathedral work had intensified dramatically as the weather had improved. Masons worked on scaffolding, placing stones, creating the rising walls that would eventually support the great weight of the vault. The sound of their work filled the air, a percussion of hammer and chisel, the calls of workers coordinating effort, the creak of ropes and pulleys. The workshop was already warm when Edmund arrived, and he found not only Guillaume, but also a visiting master craftsman from another cathedral, a man named Henry who had traveled from the south to share techniques and learn about the work being done here. "Edmund," Guillaume said warmly, "this is Master Henry. He works at the Cathedral of Chartres. I have told him about your progress, and he wishes to observe your work." Edmund felt a moment of self-consciousness at being observed by someone of Henry's evident experience. But the visiting craftsman's weathered face held only kind interest. "Show me your technique," Henry said simply, in an accent that spoke of southern regions. "Master Guillaume tells me you have an uncommon aptitude for curved work." Edmund approached the new arch stone, the first of the second arch sequence, and positioned himself to work. The visiting master stood nearby, watching with the careful attention of someone who understood the craft deeply and could read its execution in the smallest details. Edmund's hands moved through the familiar motions. Position the chisel, feel the angle, strike with precision, listen to the stone, adjust, repeat. The work was so integrated into his being now that he barely had to think about the individual steps. His hands knew what they needed to do. After perhaps 30 strikes, Henry nodded slowly. "Good," he said in his accented English. "You have learned patience. This is the most important thing, not speed, but the willingness to work slowly, to listen, to make each strike count. Many young craftsmen want to work quickly, to show their skill through speed, but true mastery is shown through patience." The visiting master spent the day in the workshop, observing not only Edmund but also the other craftsmen. He watched Thomas work on an elaborate capital, examined the practice stones where Robert and the other younger apprentices were learning, observed Guillaume as he moved through the workshop offering guidance. At the midday meal, Henry sat with Guillaume and Edmund, and the conversation turned to the nature of craft and apprenticeship. "How long have you been training?" Henry asked Edmund. "Nearly 3 months," Edmund replied. Henry nodded thoughtfully. "You are progressing rapidly. At Chartres, it takes most apprentices a full year to reach the level of confidence you are showing. But speed of learning is not always a blessing. The craftsmen who learn too quickly sometimes miss the deeper understanding that comes from struggle. Edmund has had the benefit of excellent teaching," Guillaume said modestly, "and he has the gift for listening to the stone. Not every apprentice possesses this quality." "This is true," Henry agreed. "The craft can be taught, the technique can be learned, but the connection to the material, this cannot be taught. It must be discovered within oneself." After the meal, Henry spent the afternoon working on a demonstration stone, showing the assembled apprentices and craftsmen a particular technique for creating complex transitional curves. His hands moved with the authority of someone who had worked stone for decades, and the apprentices watched in absolute silence, absorbing every movement. When Henry had finished his demonstration, Guillaume spoke to the group. "Master Henry will be with us for 1 more week," he announced. "He has offered to work with some of you on advanced techniques. Those who wish to learn from him are welcome to do so. This is a rare opportunity to learn from a master craftsman from another cathedral, to understand how different regions approach the same fundamental work." Over the following week, Edmund found himself working more closely with both Guillaume and Henry. The visiting master would observe his work on the second arch and offer subtle suggestions for refinement, small adjustments in angle, variations in technique that would create slightly different effects. "You are developing your own style," Henry observed one afternoon as he watched Edmund work. "This is good. The fundamental technique is the same everywhere, a curved chisel, an understanding of geometry, patience. But within this framework, each craftsman develops individual approaches. Your approach is becoming more efficient, more economical in motion. This is your style emerging." The concept of individual style within the framework of traditional technique was new to Edmund. He had thought of craft as something entirely fixed, entirely prescribed. But Henry's observation suggested there was room for personal expression, for the development of individual mastery that was recognizable as distinctly one's own work. As the week progressed and spring deepened toward full summer, the cathedral itself continued its rapid transformation. The western arch that Edmund had shaped was now fully in place, supporting the weight of the new wall section rising above it. The masons had begun placement of the second arch stones, Edmund's stones, now being integrated into the structure. One afternoon, Edmund stood in the cathedral and looked up at the arch he had created. The stone was no longer in the workshop, no longer something he worked on with his hands. It had become part of something eternal, something that would stand regardless of whether Edmund himself continued to live. The thought was both humbling and deeply satisfying. Master Henry remained in the workshop for another 10 days, working closely with the more advanced apprentices. He shared not only technique, but also philosophy, the understanding of how individual stones work together to create strength, how the craft required both technical precision and intuitive understanding. "Architecture is conversation," Henry said one afternoon, speaking to the gathered craftsmen. "The stones speak to each other. The arch speaks to the vault above it. The vault speaks to the walls. Everything must communicate in harmony or the structure fails. Your work as a craftsman is to ensure that the stones you shape can speak clearly to the stones beside them, above them, below them." Edmund absorbed these words deeply. The work was not an isolated effort. It was part of a vast conversation that extended across space and time, the stones speaking to each other, the craftsmen speaking through their stones, the structure itself speaking to the people who inhabited it and experienced it. When Henry departed, the workshop felt quieter, though the work continued at the same steady pace. The visiting master had left behind not just instruction, but a broadened understanding of what the craft meant, not merely technical execution, but participation in something vast and eternal. Summer deepened, and the work intensified further. Edmund had now completed the first 3 stones of the second arch and was progressing steadily on the 4th. The technique had become so refined that Guillaume rarely needed to examine his work. The quality was consistent and excellent. Thomas had progressed even further, and Guillaume had begun allowing him to work on some of the more complex architectural elements, the ribs that would support the vault, the carefully articulated moldings that would grace the interior spaces. One afternoon, as the summer heat lay heavy on the workshop, Guillaume called both Thomas and Edmund to the design table. "I want to show you something," the older craftsman said, unrolling a new parchment. It showed a section of the cathedral's interior, and marked on it were several of the arch stones and capitals that the apprentices had shaped. "This is the completed section," Guillaume explained, pointing to each element. "Your work, both of you, is marked here in gold. When this section is complete, it will stand as a record of your contribution. Future craftsmen will see your work and understand that apprentices of this generation created it." Edmund studied the drawing, seeing his own work marked out, understanding how it fit into the larger structure. The first arch was there, the stones he had so carefully shaped now permanently marked as part of the cathedral's skeleton. "In another year," Guillaume continued, "perhaps, too, you will be ready to be considered journeymen. You will have learned the fundamental techniques, understood the principles, developed your own approaches. At that point, you will be qualified to work independently, to take on commissions, to guide other apprentices." The timeline suddenly felt both distant and approaching. Edmund was only 18 years old now, and the thought of being considered a journeyman, someone who could work independently, seemed impossibly advanced. Yet at the same time, the progression of learning had been so steady, so consistent, that he could see the possibility clearly ahead. That evening, Edmund knelt in the cathedral beneath the arch he had helped create. The summer light was golden and rich, streaming through the high windows, catching the stone in beautiful angles. He thought about Henry's words, that the stones speak to each other, that the craftsman's work is to ensure this conversation is clear and harmonious. His stones were speaking clearly. They had found their place in the structure. They were doing the work they had been shaped to do, supporting the weight above them, creating beauty for those who experienced it, and participating in the eternal conversation of the cathedral. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in the warm darkness of the summer night and felt the deep peace that came from knowing exactly where one belonged, what one's purpose was, how one's efforts contributed to something vast and enduring. The craft had claimed him completely. The stone had taught him its secrets. His hands had learned to listen and respond. And the path forward toward journeyman status, toward mastery, toward a lifetime of creating beauty and strength in stone, stretched before him clear and certain. 2 years more, perhaps. 2 years of continued learning, of refining technique, of deepening understanding. And then he would step into the next phase of his journey, carrying with him everything the craft had taught him, ready to teach others as he himself had been taught. Edmund's breathing deepened as sleep approached. The cathedral stood above him, patient and eternal, and the work would continue, stone by stone, season by season, year by year, in the unhurried rhythm of creation that had sustained the craft for centuries and would sustain it for centuries to come. Edmund woke to the sound of autumn rain, a gentle, steady percussion on the workshop roof that spoke of the changing season. He had been at the cathedral for nearly a year now, and the turning of seasons had become part of the rhythm of his life, as much as the rhythm of work itself. He dressed quickly and made his way through the damp morning toward the workshop. The courtyard glistened with moisture, and the air carried that particular quality of early autumn, still warm, but with an edge of coolness that spoke of winter's eventual return. The leaves on the trees were just beginning to shift color, touches of gold and amber appearing among the green. The workshop was warm and dry, the braziers creating a comfortable atmosphere against the damp weather outside. Guillaume stood at the design table, studying a new section of plans that had arrived from the bishop's architects. The older craftsman looked up as Edmund entered. "Good morning," Guillaume said. "I have something to discuss with you." Edmund approached the table, and Guillaume gestured toward the plans. "The bishop has commissioned an expansion of the cathedral's southern transept. This will require many new arch stones, capitals, and decorative work. I have recommended to Master Claude that you and Thomas take on significant responsibility for this expansion. You would work with greater independence. I would oversee, but not guide every strike as I do now." Edmund felt his heart quicken at this news. This was the next step, moving from apprenticeship toward journeyman status. The trust being offered was both a compliment and a challenge. "Are you ready for this?" Guillaume asked, his weathered face studying Edmund with careful attention. "Yes," Edmund said with complete certainty. "I am ready." Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened, Edmund and Thomas began working on the southern transept expansion. The work was more complex than anything Edmund had undertaken independently. The arch stones for this section were larger, the curves more intricate, the precision required even greater. But Edmund found that his hands knew what to do. The thousands of strikes with the chisel, the countless hours of listening to stone, the gradual refinement of technique over months of patient practice, all of this had prepared him. He could now work with minimal oversight, making adjustments independently, solving problems as they arose. Guillaume's role shifted subtly. Instead of guiding every element of Edmund's work, he now observed more broadly, intervening only when necessary, allowing Edmund to develop the confidence and independence that would characterize a journeyman craftsman. One afternoon in late autumn, as the rain continued its gentle presence outside the workshop, a messenger arrived with news that created unexpected excitement. The bishop himself would be visiting the workshop the following week to inspect progress on the expansion work. Edmund felt a moment of uncertainty at this news. He had met the bishop once before, but this would be different. This would be an inspection of work he had done independently, work that would be judged by the highest authority in the cathedral. But Guillaume's response was calm and reassuring. The bishop comes to understand progress, not to judge harshly. Show him your work honestly. Explain your approach. Let the quality of your stones speak for themselves. The week that followed was one of meticulous preparation. Edmund refined the arch stones he was completing, ensuring every detail was perfect. Thomas did the same with the capitals and decorative elements he was working on. Young Robert, now becoming more confident in his own skills, worked diligently on the practice pieces under careful supervision. When the bishop arrived on a gray autumn afternoon, he came with Master Claude and several cathedral officials. Guillaume greeted them with respect and led them through the workshop, explaining the progress on the southern transept expansion. The bishop was a thoughtful observer. He examined the new arch stones carefully, asking questions about the techniques, understanding the progression of work. When he came to Edmund's section, he paused to study the work more closely. Master Guillaume tells me this section was executed largely independently, the bishop said, turning to Edmund. Explain to me your approach to the curves on these stones. Edmund felt his mouth go dry for a moment, but then his hands and his understanding took over. He picked up one of the stones and pointed out the subtle variations in curve, explained how each stone transitioned to the next, described the geometric principles that Guillaume had taught him. The bishop listened with complete attention, and when Edmund finished, the older man nodded slowly. "This is excellent work," he said simply. "The quality rivals anything Master Guillaume produces himself. You have learned well, and you have clearly moved beyond the stage of apprenticeship into genuine mastery." After the bishop and his party departed, Guillaume came to Edmund with a particular expression of satisfaction on his weathered face. "That was an important moment," the older craftsman said quietly. "The bishop's recognition matters. It means that your work is now known at the highest levels of the cathedral administration. Your reputation is beginning to establish itself." As autumn deepened toward winter, Edmund found himself working with increasing confidence on the southern transept expansion. The arch stones were being completed at a steady pace, and the masons had begun placement on the new section. Edmund could walk into the cathedral and see his work becoming part of the structure itself, no longer potential, but actual, permanent, eternal. One afternoon, as the first frost of the season touched the workshop windows, Guillaume called Edmund and Thomas together. "I want to discuss your future with both of you," the older craftsman said. "You have both progressed beyond the point of needing extensive guidance. Within the next few months, you will have completed your formal apprenticeships. At that point, you will be journeymen, qualified to work independently, to take commissions, to train apprentices of your own if you choose." Thomas listened intently, but Edmund found his mind already moving beyond the formal end of apprenticeship. He had been thinking, over recent weeks, about what came after. "What happens then?" Edmund asked. "After journeyman status is achieved?" "That depends on your ambitions," Guillaume replied. "Some journeymen work for other masters, contributing their skills to various cathedral projects. Some establish themselves independently, taking on private commissions, tombs, decorative elements, architectural details for noble houses or wealthy merchants. Some, after years of additional experience, eventually achieve master status and train their own apprentices." "How long does it take to become a master?" Edmund asked. Guillaume considered this thoughtfully. "I achieved master status at 35 years old. I had been working as a stone since I was 16. Nearly 20 years of experience were required before I felt I had earned that rank. And even now, at 59 years old, I continue to learn from each stone, each project, each new challenge." Edmund absorbed this information. "I am 35 years old. Another 17 years of work beyond journeyman status. A lifetime dedicated to the craft, to gradual refinement, to deepening mastery." But the thought did not seem distant or burdensome. It felt like the natural unfolding of a path he had already chosen with his entire being. The craft was not something separate from his life. It was his life. His hands belonged to stone, and stone was teaching him in ways that went far beyond technique. That evening, Edmund walked through the cathedral after the daily prayers had concluded. The interior was cool and dimly lit, the candles casting gentle shadows across the stone. He stood beneath the arches he had helped create and thought about the long road stretching ahead. 17 years more until master status. Decades of work after that. Possibly 50, 60, even 70 years of creating beauty in stone, of listening to the material, of contributing to the eternal structure of the cathedral and other buildings yet unknown. The thought filled him with peace rather than overwhelm. This was exactly what he wanted, to dedicate himself completely to a craft that demanded everything and gave back something eternal in return. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in the darkness of the autumn night and felt the particular satisfaction that comes from clarity of purpose. He knew who he was. He knew what he was called to do. He knew that the path was long but worthy, demanding but deeply fulfilling. The craft had claimed him. The stone had taught him. His hands had learned their vocation. And the work would continue through the remainder of his apprenticeship, through years of journeyman experience, through the long climb toward master status, and onward into decades of creating beauty and strength in stone. Tomorrow there will be more arch stones to shape. The week after that, more. The months ahead would bring the completion of his apprenticeship, the acknowledgement of journeyman status, the transition into more independent work. But the fundamental rhythm would remain the same: the strike of chisel on stone, the listening, the adjustment, the gradual revelation of form from within the material. Edmund, 18 years old, transformed completely from the uncertain boy who had arrived at the cathedral a year ago, drifted toward sleep with the deep peace of someone who had found not just a trade, but a vocation, not just a skill, but a way of being in the world. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, growing stone by stone, arch by arch, year by year. And Edmund's hands, marked now with the calluses of a craftsman, would contribute to that growth for the rest of his life. The work was eternal, and he belonged to it completely. Edmund woke on the morning of his 19th birthday to the sound of winter wind moving through the dormitory eaves. Snow had come during the night, and the world beyond the windows lay pristine and quiet under a blanket of white. He lay for a moment in stillness, aware that something significant had shifted in the passage of time. Another year had gone by, another year of the craft, another year of learning. He dressed in extra wool layers against the cold and made his way across the snow-covered courtyard toward the workshop. The cathedral rose above him, its stones stark and beautiful against the white landscape. Icicles hung from the eaves, catching the pale winter light. The world seemed held in suspension, waiting. The workshop was warm and welcoming, and Guillaume had prepared hot water for the craftsmen to warm their hands before beginning work. The older craftsman looked at Edmund as he entered and smiled, a rare expression that suggested he remembered what day it was. 19 years old today, Guillaume said simply. It was not a question. Yes, Edmund confirmed. You have been with us just over a year, Guillaume continued. In that time, you have progressed further than most apprentices progress in 3 years. Your hands have learned what takes most craftsmen much longer to understand. Today, I want to mark this birthday in a particular way. Guillaume led Edmund to a special corner of the workshop where a magnificent piece of limestone sat on a sturdy table. It was larger than any stone Edmund had worked with before, pale and beautiful, waiting. This is for you, Guillaume said. This will be your masterwork, the piece that will demonstrate your progression from apprentice toward journeyman status. It is a capital, one of the ornamental tops of a column. The design is complex, requiring techniques you have practiced, techniques you have not yet attempted, and techniques you will need to develop to complete it. Edmund approached the stone with reverence. It was indeed beautiful, nearly 2 feet in height, with a carefully marked design showing elaborate decorative carving, in addition to the geometric precision required for the capital's structural elements. This will take some time, Guillaume continued. Perhaps 3 months of steady work, but when it is complete, it will be displayed in the cathedral as a testament to your skill. It will carry your name, made by Edmund, apprentice of Master Guillaume, carved into its base. When people look at it, they will know that a young craftsman created it, and they will understand the level of skill you have achieved. Edmund felt the weight of this honor. To have a piece displayed with his name, to have his individual work recognized publicly, this was more than he had expected. Over the following weeks, as winter deepened, Edmund began the work on his masterwork Capital. The design was complex, elaborate leaves and vines emerging from a central core, each element requiring different techniques, different approaches to the stone. Guillaume gave him complete freedom in how to approach the work. There were no detailed instructions, no constant oversight. Edmund had to make decisions about technique, about the order of carving, about how to best reveal the intended form from the stone. The work was different from anything he had done before. The arch stones had been beautiful but relatively straightforward in their curves. The capitals and decorative work Thomas had been doing required more intricate carving, but Edmund had watched Thomas work and understood the basic approaches. This was his own challenge, his own mountain to climb, and the climbing was both deeply satisfying and occasionally frustrating as he encountered technical problems that required creative solutions. Thomas watched his progress with brotherly interest, occasionally offering suggestions when Edmund seemed stuck on a particular element. Robert and the other young apprentices observed with something like awe Edmund was attempting something clearly beyond their current capabilities, and they understood they were watching him move into more advanced mastery. By late winter, the capital was taking clear shape. The leaves and vines were emerging from the stone with increasing clarity, each one unique and beautiful. The work required extraordinary patience. Some of the fine details took hours to create just a few inches of carving. One afternoon, as snow fell gently outside the workshop windows, Guillaume came to examine Edmund's progress. The older craftsman spent a long time studying the work, running his weathered hands over the carved surfaces, understanding through touch what Edmund's hands had created. "This is beautiful work," Guillaume said finally. "You have achieved something that goes beyond technical competence. You have created beauty. This is the difference between a craftsman who executes technique and a craftsman who understands that technique is the servant of beauty. You understand this." The words settled deeply into Edmund. It was true. As the work had progressed, he had become less focused on executing the prescribed design perfectly and more engaged with revealing the beauty inherent in the stone itself. He was allowing the material to guide him toward decisions about depth, angle, and finish that went beyond what the original design specified. As spring approached, Edmund neared completion of the capital. The final details required the most careful work, the deepest carving, the finest lines, the most delicate transitions between elements. He worked with complete focus, aware that every strike now was part of the final definition of the piece. Master Claude returned to the workshop in early spring with his usual purpose, to inspect progress on the cathedral projects. When he saw Edmund's capital, he paused for a considerable time, examining it from multiple angles. "This is exceptional work," Claude said to Guillaume, and then turned to Edmund. "You have created something that demonstrates mastery beyond what one would expect from an apprentice. This capital will be one of the finest in the cathedral. I insist that it be placed in a prominent location, in the transept where many people will see it and understand the quality of work being done here." Edmund felt a profound sense of accomplishment at these words. The capital was nearly complete now. Just the final refinement of edges and surfaces remained, and it would be displayed not in some hidden corner, but in a prominent location where people would see it and understand his contribution. The final work took another 2 weeks. Edmund spent hours on the last details, polishing surfaces, refining edges, ensuring that every element was as perfect as his hands could make it. The leaf veins had to be just right. The transitions between elements had to be smooth and deliberate. The overall composition had to create a sense of natural grace despite the complexity of the carving. When it was finally complete, Edmund stepped back and examined his work with a kind of awe. The capital was beautiful, more beautiful than he had anticipated when he began. The stone had revealed possibilities he had not foreseen, and his hands had found ways to express them. Guillaume came to examine the finished piece, and his weathered face held profound satisfaction. "This is masterwork," he said simply. "Not in the formal sense, you are not yet qualified to bear that title, but in the true sense, this piece demonstrates mastery of technique and understanding of beauty. You should be proud of what your hands have created." The capital was carefully transported to the cathedral and placed in the southern transept, in a prominent location where it would be seen by all who entered that space. A small plaque was carved beneath it. "This capital was created by Edmund, apprentice of Master Guillaume, in the year of our Lord 1248. Edmund stood beneath the capital and looked up at his own work, now permanently integrated into the cathedral structure. The stone seemed to glow in the cathedral light, and the carved leaves and vines appeared to dance with life despite being rendered in solid limestone. This was his contribution to the eternal structure. This was his hands' work, made visible and permanent. It would outlast him by centuries. Future generations would look at it and understand that a young craftsman working in the 13th century had created something beautiful and enduring. That evening, Edmund walked through the cathedral with Guillaume. The older craftsman led him to various locations, pointing out pieces that he himself had created over his decades of work. "That capital, I carved that 20 years ago. Those arch stones, I shaped them when I was not much older than you are now. That decorative molding, I created that 15 years ago," Guillaume said, and Edmund understood that he was being shown the physical evidence of a lifetime's work, the tangible proof that dedication to the craft created beauty that endured through time. "This is what awaits you," Guillaume said quietly. "A lifetime of creating, of contributing to structures that will long outlast you. It is not a life of wealth or fame in the worldly sense, but it is a life of deep satisfaction, of knowing that your hands have created beauty, that your work participates in something eternal." Back in the dormitory that night, Edmund lay in darkness and felt the full weight of what his life had become. He was no longer an apprentice in any fundamental sense. He had achieved mastery of the craft's basic techniques. He had created a masterwork that bore his name. He had contributed to the cathedral in ways that were recognized and valued. But he was also aware that this was only the beginning. The true mastery, the decades of refinement, the development of deeper understanding, the creation of works that would approach the greatness of what master craftsmen like Guillaume could produce, all of that still lay ahead. The path was long, but Edmund was content with its length. The craft had claimed him completely, and he belonged to it with every part of his being. His hands knew what they were made to do. His heart understood why the work mattered. His life had found its true direction. Tomorrow there would be new commissions, new stones to shape, new opportunities to listen to the material and create beauty from it. The work would continue, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries to come. Edmund, 19 years old, marked now as a craftsman of recognized skill, drifted toward sleep with the deep peace of someone who had found not just purpose, but vocation, a calling that gave meaning to every day, that connected him to countless craftsmen across time, that made him part of something eternal and beautiful. The cathedral stood above him in the darkness, patient and eternal, built stone by craftsmen like him, sustained by patience and skill, and the quiet devotion of hands willing to serve something larger than themselves. Edmund woke to the sound of spring rain, a gentle, warm rain that spoke of the season turning toward full summer. He had been at the cathedral for just over a year and a half now, and the rhythm of seasons had become as familiar as the rhythm of his own breathing. He dressed and made his way to the workshop, where the morning light was already bright and golden. The trees in the cathedral grounds had fully leafed out, and the air carried the richness of growing things. The world felt alive and vital, full of possibility. The workshop itself hummed with activity. Guillaume stood at the design table with Master Claude, and another man Edmund did not recognize, a nobleman dressed in fine wool, his bearing suggesting rank and authority. The three men were engaged in intense discussion, examining plans that lay spread across the table. When Guillaume noticed Edmund, he gestured him forward. "Edmund, come meet Master Bernard. He oversees construction for the Duke's new chapel being built in the valley north of here. He has come to examine our work and discuss a commission." Edmund approached respectfully, uncertain what this meant. A nobleman wanted to commission work. He had assumed he would continue at the cathedral, gradually progressing toward master status under Guillaume's guidance. Master Bernard studied Edmund with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating skill and character. The older man's eyes were keen and intelligent, and his weathered face suggested he understood the craft, even if he was not himself a stoneworker. "Master Guillaume speaks highly of your abilities," Bernard said. "He tells me you have created work of exceptional quality. I am building a chapel for my lord, and I require arch stones and decorative elements of the highest quality. Guillaume has suggested that you might be ready to take on a significant portion of this commission, working under his general oversight, but with considerable independence." Edmund felt his heart quicken. This was a crucial moment. The offer represented recognition that he had moved beyond apprenticeship into the realm of independent craftsmen, whose work could be trusted for important commissions. "I would be honored," Edmund said carefully, understanding the significance of the moment. "Good," Master Bernard replied. "The work will begin in 2 months. You will work here, creating the stones, and then they will be transported to the site for placement. I expect the same quality that Guillaume produces. Can you provide that?" "Yes," Edmund said with complete certainty. "I can." After Master Bernard departed, Guillaume came to Edmund with an expression that combined satisfaction and challenge. "This is an important opportunity," the older craftsman said. "A commission from a nobleman opens doors. If you do excellent work, word will spread. Other nobles will seek you out. Your reputation will grow beyond the cathedral. This is how craftsmen eventually establish their independence, build their own following, perhaps eventually achieve master status and open their own workshop." Over the following weeks, as late spring deepened toward early summer, Edmund worked on preparing materials and beginning preliminary designs for the chapel commission. Master Bernard wanted 12 arch stones, larger and more complex than those Edmund had created for the cathedral, plus several decorative capitals and moldings. The work was challenging, but not beyond Edmund's capabilities. Guillaume provided oversight and guidance when needed, but increasingly allowed Edmund to make his own decisions about technique and approach. Thomas watched this development with interest and perhaps a touch of envy. He had progressed well in his own training, but he had not yet attracted the attention of patrons outside the cathedral. Edmund understood that this was somewhat arbitrary. His own advancement had benefited from the particular combination of being the first apprentice to work under Guillaume's renewed focus, demonstrating rapid progress, and creating a masterwork capital that had impressed the right people. One afternoon, as Edmund was laying out the first of the arch stones for the chapel commission, Thomas came to work beside him. "I'm happy for you," Thomas said simply, "though I'll admit I'm a bit envious. I've been here almost as long as you, and I haven't yet attracted notice from anyone important." "Guillaume thinks highly of your work," Edmund said, understanding that his friend needed reassurance. "You're creating capitals that are as fine as anything in the cathedral. It's only a matter of time before someone important recognizes that." "Perhaps," Thomas replied, "but I'm thinking I might leave the cathedral within the next year or so. Guillaume suggested that I might seek apprenticeship with a master in a different cathedral, somewhere I could develop my own reputation from the beginning, rather than always being in his shadow." Edmund understood the logic of this, though the thought of Thomas leaving the cathedral created a small sadness. The two of them had worked side by side for over a year, had learned together, and had supported each other through the challenges of the craft. But they both understood that growth sometimes required distance, new challenges, new contexts in which to develop. As summer approached, the first of the arch stones for the chapel commission were completed. Master Bernard returned to inspect them, and he examined each one with the careful attention of someone who understood quality and would accept nothing less. "These are excellent," Bernard said finally. "They match the quality that Guillaume produces. I am satisfied. Continue with the remainder of the commission. I will return in 3 months to inspect progress." Edmund worked steadily through the summer, completing the arch stones for the chapel commission. The work was absorbing, demanding, deeply satisfying. Each stone was a new opportunity to refine technique, to push beyond previous achievements, to create beauty that would serve a specific purpose. Guillaume observed Edmund's work with the pride of a teacher watching a student fully claim their capabilities. The older craftsman offered guidance less frequently now, and when he did, it was often to suggest approaches rather than to correct errors. Edmund had earned the right to make his own decisions, to learn from his own mistakes, to develop his individual style within the framework of the traditional craft. One afternoon in late summer, as Edmund was completing the 11th arch stone for the chapel, Guillaume called him to the design table. "I want to discuss your future," the older craftsman said. "You have demonstrated mastery beyond what I expected at this stage of your development. You have attracted a patron who trusts you with significant work. You have created a masterwork capital that bears your name in the cathedral." Guillaume paused, letting these facts settle. "I believe you are ready to move beyond the formal structure of apprenticeship," he continued. "You have two options. You can continue working here, gradually taking on more independent commissions while remaining part of my workshop. This is a secure path. You would develop your reputation, eventually achieve master status, perhaps eventually take over the workshop when I retire." He pointed to a second set of plans on the table. "Or," Guillaume continued, "you can establish yourself independently. You could seek patrons, take on commissions for other craftsmen or directly for nobles and merchants, build your own reputation and following. This path is less certain, more demanding, but it offers the possibility of greater independence and recognition." Edmund considered these options carefully. The first path was secure and stable. The second was uncertain, but offered the possibility of true independence and the full development of his own vision and style. "I need time to think about this," Edmund said finally. "You have time," Guillaume replied, "but not unlimited time. The chapel commission will be complete in another month. After that, you will need to decide. If you choose to remain here, we can discuss new arrangements. If you choose to establish yourself independently, we should discuss how to facilitate your transition while maintaining good relations." That evening, Edmund walked through the cathedral as he often did after work was complete. He stood beneath the capital he had created, his masterwork, bearing his name. He looked at the arches he had shaped, the stones he had contributed to the structure. The cathedral had been his home for nearly 2 years. Guillaume had been his teacher, his guide, the one who had recognized his potential and nurtured it. The other craftsmen had become like brothers. The workshop had become as familiar as the dormitory where he slept. But he was aware that staying would eventually mean remaining in Guillaume's shadow, no matter how successful he became. To truly establish his own reputation, to develop his own voice as a craftsman, he would eventually need to step away and work independently. Back in the dormitory, Edmund lay in darkness and thought about the choice before him. He was not yet 20 years old. Master status seemed impossibly distant, still 15 or more years away at minimum. The path of independence was uncertain, demanding, risky. but it was also a path that would allow him to claim his own work fully, to develop his own approach, to build a reputation based on his own capabilities, rather than remaining always an apprentice of Master Guillaume. By morning, Edmund knew what he had to do. He waited for an appropriate moment and found Guillaume working alone in the workshop, examining a piece of decorative molding that a new apprentice had completed. "I have made my decision," Edmund said quietly. "I want to establish myself independently. When the chapel commission is complete, I would like to seek my own commissions and build my own reputation." Guillaume nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he had expected. "This is the right choice for you," the older craftsman said. "You have the skill and the temperament for independent work. You will need to be strategic about building your reputation, careful about the commissions you accept, and diligent about maintaining quality. But I believe you will succeed." He extended his weathered hand, and Edmund shook it, a gesture that seemed to mark the transition from student to peer, from apprentice to craftsman claiming independence. "I will help you establish yourself," Guillaume continued. "I will write letters to patrons I know, recommending your work. I will help you understand the business aspects of independent craft work. You will always have my support, Edmund. This is not the end of our relationship, but a transformation of it." As the summer turned toward autumn, Edmund completed the final arch stones for the chapel commission. He worked with particular care, understanding that this would be the first significant work bearing his independent reputation, the foundation upon which his future would be built. Master Bernard returned to collect the completed stones, and he examined each one with the careful attention that had become familiar. When he looked at Edmund, his expression held clear approval. "Your work is excellent," Bernard said. "These arches will stand for centuries. When other patrons ask who created them, I will tell them about the young craftsman named Edmund. Your reputation is beginning, my boy. Protect it carefully." That evening, Edmund stood beneath his masterwork capital one final time as an apprentice. Tomorrow, he would begin his independent life as a craftsman, seeking commissions, building his own reputation, claiming the craft fully as his own. The capital glowed in the cathedral light, beautiful and permanent, bearing his name. It was both a beginning and an ending, the end of his apprenticeship, the beginning of his independent journey as a craftsman. Back in the dormitory, Edmund packed his few possessions. He would leave the cathedral workshop, but he would not leave far. He would find lodgings in the town near the cathedral, establish himself as an independent craftsman available for commissions, and gradually build the reputation that would eventually, years from now, allow him to be considered for master status. As he lay in darkness for what would be one of his last nights in the apprentice dormitory, Edmund felt the profound peace of someone who has made a decision and knows it is right. The craft had prepared him. The stone had taught him. His hands were ready. Tomorrow, his true journey as an independent craftsman would begin. Edmund woke to the sound of autumn wind moving through the eaves of his new lodgings, a small room above a mason's workshop in the town adjacent to the cathedral. The space was modest but adequate, and it had become his own in the weeks since he had left Guillaume's apprenticeship. He dressed in the cool morning air and made his way down to the workshop that had become his primary workspace. The mason who owned the building, a man named Richard, had agreed to allow Edmund to use the stoneworking area in exchange for a share of his earnings and occasional work on the mason's own projects. The arrangement was practical and beneficial to both men. Richard gained access to a highly skilled stoneworker for his commissions, and Edmund gained a secure workspace and a connection to potential clients. It was the kind of mutually beneficial relationship that the craft seemed to naturally encourage. This morning, Edmund was expecting his first independent commission to arrive. A wealthy merchant from a town 2 days' journey away had written to Guillaume, requesting recommendations for a craftsman who could create decorative elements for a new market hall. Guillaume had written back, recommending Edmund and describing his work in terms that suggested genuine confidence in the young craftsman's abilities. By midday, the merchant himself appeared, a portly, prosperous-looking man named Thomas who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. He examined Edmund's completed work for the cathedral and the chapel commission with careful attention. "These are fine stones," Thomas said finally. "I need 30 linear feet of decorative molding for the interior of my market hall. It should be beautiful but not overly ornate, something that will catch the eye but won't overwhelm the space. Can you provide this?" Edmund quoted a price that he had carefully calculated based on what he understood to be fair compensation for the work and materials. The merchant negotiated downward slightly, as Edmund had expected, but only to a reasonable degree. A transaction was agreed upon, and the merchant paid a deposit in silver coins. After he departed, Edmund held the coins in his palm, feeling their weight. This was real, independent commissions, independent income, independent reputation building. He was no longer supported by the cathedral or by Guillaume's patronage. He was supporting himself through the skill of his hands. Over the following months, Edmund worked steadily on the merchant's commission while also accepting smaller jobs from Richard and from local craftsmen seeking specialized stone carving. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying. He was his own master now, making decisions about technique, setting his own schedule, building his own reputation. Winter arrived, cold and challenging. The stone was harder in the frost, the workshop colder, the work more physically demanding. But Edmund had learned to work in winter. He had done so for over a year, and he adapted his technique accordingly. One afternoon in late winter, as snow fell gently outside the workshop, Thomas, now working as a journeyman carpenter, appeared with unexpected news. "I'm leaving the cathedral," Thomas said simply. "I've accepted a position with a master craftsman in Rouen, working on the cathedral there. It's a better opportunity for me, a chance to develop my own reputation in a different context." Edmund felt the particular sadness that comes from knowing a friendship is transforming, shifting away from daily contact. But he understood the rightness of Thomas's decision. "When do you leave?" Edmund asked. "In 3 weeks," Thomas replied. "I wanted to say goodbye in person rather than simply disappearing. We learned together, Edmund. I'm grateful for that. They spent that evening together, reminiscing about their time in Guillaume's workshop, remembering the early struggles and the gradual victories as their hands had learned the craft. By the time Thomas departed for Rouen, Edmund had accepted the change with the grace that comes from understanding that growth sometimes means distance. Spring arrived, and with it, increased commissions. Word had begun to spread, through Guillaume's letters, through the visible work Edmund had created, through recommendations from satisfied patrons, that there was a young craftsman of exceptional skill available for independent commissions. Edmund completed the Merchants' Market Hall decoration and received enthusiastic feedback. The merchant paid the final balance in full, plus a bonus, commenting that the work exceeded his expectations. He promised to recommend Edmund to other patrons. Through the spring and into early summer, Edmund found himself with more commissions than he could manage. He hired a young apprentice, a boy of 14 named William, to help with the basic preparation work and the less complex elements of his commissions. William was eager to learn, and Edmund found himself in the position of teacher, passing on the knowledge that Guillaume had passed to him. One afternoon in late summer, as Edmund was working on a particularly complex capital for a wealthy merchant's house, Guillaume appeared at the workshop. The older craftsman looked much as he always did, weathered, capable, quiet. But there was something in his expression that suggested the purpose of his visit was important. "I wanted to see how you are progressing," Guillaume said, examining Edmund's work with careful attention. "I have heard good reports from various patrons. Your reputation is establishing itself well." "I'm grateful for your initial recommendations," Edmund replied. "They gave me the foundation I needed to begin." "You have earned the rest yourself," Guillaume said. He paused, then continued. "I am getting older, Edmund. I am 59 years old now, and while I hope to work for many more years, I am thinking about the future of my workshop. I have no children. Thomas has gone to Rouen. Robert is progressing well as an apprentice, but he is still years away from being ready to take on significant responsibility." Guillaume looked directly at Edmund. "I have come to ask if you would be willing to consider taking over the workshop eventually. Not immediately. You are still establishing your independent reputation, and that is important. But in perhaps 5 or 10 years, as you progress toward master status, would you be willing to return to the Cathedral workshop as my successor?" Edmund felt the weight of this question. It was a significant honor and also a significant responsibility. The Cathedral workshop was the center of stone carving for the entire region. Taking it over would mean committing to the cathedral itself, to Guillaume's apprentices, to the long-term vision of the building's completion. "I need time to consider this," Edmund said carefully. "Of course," Guillaume replied, "but I wanted you to know that the possibility exists. You have the skill, the character, and the understanding of the craft necessary to lead a workshop. When you are ready to make a decision, we can discuss it further." After Guillaume departed, Edmund sat alone in the workshop and thought about the choice being offered. Independence was important to him, and he had fought for it. But he also understood that there was a difference between independence and isolation. He was making a good living now. His reputation was growing. He had taken on an apprentice and was finding satisfaction in teaching. But the workshop at the cathedral offered something his independent practice could not: the prestige of working on one of the most important building projects in the region, the opportunity to guide other craftsmen, the security and resources that came with official patronage. In the weeks that followed, Edmund found himself thinking about this choice frequently. He continued his independent work, accepting commissions, building his reputation. But the seed that Guillaume had planted, the possibility of returning to the workshop, of becoming its master someday, began to grow in his mind. One afternoon in autumn, as the leaves turned gold and red, Edmund walked through the cathedral with Guillaume. The older craftsman showed him the work that had been completed in the months since Edmund had left: new sections of wall, additional arches, and decorative elements that had been installed. "The cathedral is nearly half complete," Guillaume said quietly. "At the current pace, the major structural work will be finished in another 10 or 15 years. The interior decoration and finishing work will continue after that. It is a lifetime project, not my lifetime, but the lifetime of the craft as it passes from generation to generation." They stood beneath one of Edmund's arch stones from his early apprenticeship, and Guillaume placed his weathered hand on it. "This will outlast us both," he said simply. "This is the real measure of success in our craft. Not wealth, not fame in the worldly sense, but the creation of something that endures, that serves a purpose for centuries, that becomes part of the eternal structure." Edmund looked at the arch stone and understood with complete clarity that this was what he wanted his life to be about. Not independence for its own sake, but the freedom to work towards something eternal, something that mattered beyond the span of his own years. That evening, Edmund made a decision. He would continue his independent practice for several more years, continuing to build his reputation and develop his skills. But he would accept Guillaume's implicit offer. In 5 to 10 years, when he was closer to master status, he would return to the cathedral workshop and eventually take it over, continuing the work of training apprentices and shaping the stones that would complete the cathedral. It was not the choice of absolute independence, but it was a choice that aligned with what he had come to understand about the true nature of the craft, that it was not about individual achievement, but about participation in something eternal, something that required the dedication and skill of generations of craftsmen working together. Back in his small room above the mason's workshop, Edmund lay in darkness and felt the peace that comes from clarity about one's life direction. The path ahead was clear now: years of independent work, gradual progression toward master status, eventual return to the cathedral workshop, a lifetime dedicated to the craft and to passing it on to the next generation. He was 20 years old now, with perhaps 50, 60, or 70 years of work ahead of him. The stone would teach him for the rest of his life. His hands would serve the craft until they could no longer hold a chisel. And when the time came to pass the knowledge on, there would be other young apprentices, as eager and willing as he had been, ready to learn what the craft required. The cathedral stood eternal above the town, patient and vast, waiting for the stones that craftsmen like Edmund would shape, waiting for the slow accumulation of skill and dedication that would, over decades and centuries, complete its glory. And Edmund, with his capable hands and his deepening understanding of what the craft truly meant, drifted toward sleep knowing exactly who he was and where he belonged, not in any single moment or place, but in the eternal flow of generations of craftsmen creating beauty in stone, each one contributing their skill, their dedication, their love of the work to structures that would outlast them all. Edmund lay in darkness in his small room above the mason's workshop, listening to the soft sounds of the autumn night. The decision had been made. The path was clear. The work would continue. He thought of the cathedral, how it rose above the town, patient and eternal, built stone by craftsmen whose names were mostly forgotten but whose work endured. Guillaume's hands had shaped countless stones over decades. Edmund's hands were beginning to follow the same path. And someday, other young craftsmen would come, just as Edmund had come, and they would learn as he had learned, and their hands would know the same ancient rhythms of the craft. The arch stones he had created were already part of the structure. His masterwork capital bore his name in the cathedral, where it would be seen by people for centuries. The decorative moldings he was creating for patrons throughout the region would serve their purposes long after Edmund himself had grown old and released the chisel to younger hands. This was enough. This was everything. The wind moved gently through the eaves of the building, carrying with it the scent of stone dust and the fatting warmth of autumn. Somewhere in the distance, the cathedral bells tolled the hour, a sound that had become as familiar to Edmund as his own heartbeat. He thought of Guillaume, weathered and wise, still working at nearly 60 years old, still discovering new things in the stone, still teaching the next generation. Someday Edmund would be like that, his hands marked by decades of work, his eyes trained to see beauty in raw stone, his mind holding the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime's dedication. But that was far ahead. For now, there was simply the present moment, the darkness, the peace, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more work, more opportunities to listen to the stone, more chances to shape beauty from the ancient material. He closed his eyes and let sleep come, carrying him gently toward tomorrow. The cathedral stood above the town in the starlight, vast and patient, waiting for the stones that would be shaped in the years ahead. The craft would continue, the generations would pass, and the work would endure, eternal and beautiful, a testament to human hands dedicated to creating something greater than themselves. In the workshop, the tools rested on their benches. The stones waited in patient silence. And in the morning, Edmund's hands would return to the work they were made for, listening, shaping, creating, contributing to the eternal structure that would stand long after his own dust had returned to the earth. The night deepened, peaceful and complete, and in that peace, with the knowledge that his life had found its true purpose, Edmund slept the deep, undisturbed sleep of someone who knows exactly where they belong.